A prophecy exists, or so they say. It speaks of betrayal at the highest level, of a pope abandoning the Holy See, of fireblood and silence. It was written down, sealed, and buried in the heart of the Vatican. Then, forgotten, or worse, hidden. Because what if the Vatican knows that the end is coming, not the end of the world, but the end of the Church itself? And what if that warning delivered by the Virgin herself was ignored? Welcome to one of the most carefully protected mysteries in the Catholic world. And tonight, we open the seal. Now take a breath. Let the urgency fade. Let the questions drift just slightly into the background. You're here now, and we're going to take this slowly, gently, like brushing dust from an ancient parchment. Let's begin with what's known so we can explore what's been hidden. Picture a long hallway. Stone walls cool to the touch, bathed in dim yellow light. Echoes from your own footsteps tap gently off the marble floor. Ahead, behind a heavy door bolted in iron and silence, is the secret archive of the Vatican. This is not myth, not metaphor. The Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, though recently renamed for optics, has held within it documents so powerful, so dangerous, that even popes have refused to reveal them. Most will never be read by human eyes outside the Curia. Letters from kings, transcripts of exorcisms, political bargains made in Latin, and according to some, an apocalyptic message dictated by the Mother of God. You've probably heard whispers of Fatima. In 1917, 3 shepherd children claimed to see the Virgin Mary in a field in Portugal. What followed were a series of visions, brief, radiant, and terrifying. The children described wars, the rise of communism, and something else. Something too terrible to be spoken aloud at the time. It was written down by the surviving child, Lucia dos Santos, and sealed away. First in a convent, then in the Vatican. To be revealed, it was said, no later than 1960. But when 1960 arrived, the Church said nothing. That silence would echo for decades, until the year 2000, when the Vatican finally released a document claiming to be the long-awaited Third Secret. But scholars, theologians, and even cardinals weren't convinced. Because what they released didn't match the fear, the warning, the specificity that Lucia had hinted at. It didn't explain the secrecy, or the timing, or the decision to hide it in the first place. Tonight, we're going to follow that trail. Section by section, whisper by whisper. We'll examine the contradictions in testimony, the curious behavior of popes, the rumors of an even darker fourth secret, and a prophecy that warns of collapse not from without, but from within. Could it be that the Catholic Church, the oldest surviving institution in the Western world, was warned of its own demise by heaven itself? And if so, what would make it choose silence? Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Now, step softly. We're going inside. In the spring of 1917, the world was on fire. The First World War had already carved scars into the fields of Europe. Monarchies were crumbling, and ideologies once considered fringe were stirring into revolutions. But in a quiet village in central Portugal, where children still herded sheep and mothers told bedtime stories by oil lamp, a different kind of fire was igniting. It began with a flash of light on May 13th. 3 children, Lucia dos Santos, aged 10, and her cousins Francisco and Jacinta Marto, aged 9 and 7, looked up and saw, as Lucia would later describe, a lady more brilliant than the sun. What followed were 6 apparitions, each bringing a message. Most of them were gentle, almost maternal in tone, calls for prayer, repentance, and devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. But nestled inside the glowing presence of these visions was a far darker core. According to Lucia, the lady entrusted them with 3 secrets, 3 parts of a single message to be revealed in time. The first 2 were eventually disclosed: a vision of hell and a prediction of the Second World War if humanity failed to repent. These revelations, shocking as they were, came to light in 1941 and 1942, respectively. But the third secret, the third was different. It was written down in January of 1944 under extreme conditions. Lucia, by then a Carmelite nun cloistered in a convent, had initially refused to transcribe it. She reportedly suffered bouts of anguish and fear, worried that putting the words on paper might somehow unleash their power. Only after being ordered by her bishop, and after what some say was a profound moment of interior illumination, did she finally write it out on a single piece of paper, folded and sealed. It was sent to Rome. And then everything went quiet. We know for a fact that the envelope arrived in the Vatican and was placed in the custody of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Several popes read it, beginning with Pope Pius X and possibly even earlier, but it wasn't released. Not in 1944, not in 1950, and most crucially, not in 1960, the year the children had claimed it must be revealed. That year came and went, and rather than disclose the secret, the Vatican issued a cryptic statement saying that it was not opportune to publish its contents. That decision caused a ripple effect across the Catholic world. The faithful, who had long awaited a divine message about the future of the Church, were now left in a fog of ambiguity. Speculation became doctrine. Sermons turned into puzzles. And Fatima, once a peaceful field in Portugal, became ground zero for a spiritual Cold War between Rome and its own people. The Church would eventually release what it claimed was the full Third Secret in June 2000 during the papacy of John Paul II. The official version described a symbolic vision, a bishop dressed in white climbing a ruined city filled with corpses, only to be shot and killed by soldiers. Accompanying commentary connected this vision to the failed 1981 assassination attempt on John Paul II, suggesting that the prophecy had been fulfilled and was no longer relevant. But here's where things get foggy. The original description of the secret, as hinted by those who had read it before the release, didn't seem to match the vision presented. Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, had once described the message as involving dangers to the faith and to the life of the Christian, even pointing toward end-times themes. Yet the released text made no reference to apostasy, heresy, or internal collapse, and nowhere did it mention the Virgin's words, which Lucia had supposedly been told to record verbatim. What's more, Lucia herself was never allowed to speak freely about the final message. After 1960, she was tightly controlled, her access to outsiders strictly limited. Public statements came through typed documents reviewed and approved by church authorities. When she was asked indirectly whether the 2000 release matched what she had written, her answers were vague, circumstantial, even evasive. This leads to one of the strangest elements of the entire Fatima mystery, the divide between vision and voice. The 2000 document describes only a vision, but those close to the case, including prominent theologians, have long insisted that the true secret included a spoken message, a direct prophecy from the Virgin Mary explaining the symbolic imagery and offering concrete warnings. This interpretive text was never released. If it exists, it remains locked away, buried even deeper than the vision itself. There's also the matter of the envelope, or rather, the envelopes. For decades, Vatican insiders described the secret as a handwritten letter sealed inside one envelope, placed inside another. But when the Vatican revealed the document in 2000, what they showed was not a letter, but a series of 4 sheets of paper written in Lucia's distinctive script, folded, yes, but without the extra protective enclosure that had been described. This discrepancy is more than a filing error. For some, it suggests the version we were shown was not the original at all, but a substitute or at best a partial disclosure. Of course, defenders of the Church's position argue that the symbolism is sufficient, that the bishop in white and the crumbling city were never meant to be literal, that visions are always metaphors, not blueprints. But critics fire back that a metaphor wouldn't have needed 4 decades of silence, multiple layers of secrecy, and the full machinery of Vatican protocol to protect. Something doesn't add up. And when things don't add up in a place like Rome, well, you can almost hear the marble statues raise an eyebrow. We are left with an open question that scholars, theologians, and ordinary Catholics still debate. Was the full Third Secret ever actually released? And if not, what was in the missing portion? The answers may lie not in what was said, but in who refused to say it. And in our next step, we'll examine exactly what the Vatican did release and the uncomfortable silences surrounding it. The year was 2000, a moment of symbolic transition. As the world crossed into a new millennium, the Catholic Church chose that moment to do something it had resisted for decades: publish what it claimed to be the Third Secret of Fatima. The timing was not coincidental. Pope John Paul II, who had survived a near-fatal assassination attempt in 1981, was nearing the end of his papacy. The Church was facing rising global skepticism and internal disillusionment. It needed transparency, it needed symbolism, and it needed control. The document presented to the world was a curious thing. 4 sheets of creamy paper filled with Lucia's distinctive handwriting. No direct words from the Virgin Mary, no mention of 1960, and no explanation. Instead, it described a surreal vision, a city in ruins, a pope walking through the rubble bodies lying in the streets, a hill crowned with a rough-hewn cross. At the summit, the Pope prays, and then he is gunned down by a group of soldiers. Alongside him fall bishops, priests, religious figures, each dying at the foot of the cross in silence. This was the vision the Vatican said had been hidden for half a century. And yet, there were no words, no commentary, no interpretive message. The document was purely descriptive, a silent film reel without subtitles. It didn't match the format of the earlier Fatima secrets, which had included direct speech from the Virgin, often with vivid warnings or theological urgency. This one read more like an allegory. A Rorschach blot in holy ink. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, then head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, provided an accompanying theological commentary. He said the vision was symbolic, that the Pope was John Paul II, that the ruined city was the 20th century, that the bullets represented suffering. In other words, the danger was past. The prophecy had been fulfilled. Mystery solved, but not everyone was convinced. Among the first to raise an eyebrow was the late Father Paul Kramer, a Fatima researcher, who had long argued that the real Third Secret involved heresy and apostasy within the Church itself. The vision released in 2000, he pointed out, said nothing about doctrine, about corruption, about the collapse of moral authority issues that Lucia had strongly hinted at in private letters before the 1960 deadline. And then there was the issue of the missing words. According to multiple eyewitnesses, including Cardinal Audi and Archbishop Capovilla, the true secret included a line from the Virgin warning that the great apostasy will begin at the top. This phrase, unsurprisingly, was absent. Perhaps most damning was the contrast with what had been hinted at for years. Pope John XXIII, when asked why he refused to release the Third Secret in 1960, reportedly said, This does not concern my pontificate. A strange statement given the vague and generic content of the 2000 release. If it didn't concern his pontificate, what exactly was in it? There's also the structural inconsistency. Sister Lucia herself wrote in 1941 that the third part of the secret was in the form of a letter. Yet the document released by the Vatican was clearly not a letter. There was no salutation, no signature, no transition, just description. Moreover, the earlier Fatima messages included strong calls to action, prayer, penance, consecration. But this so-called Third Secret had no such imperative. It was quiet. Too quiet. Curiously, Cardinal Bertone, one of the key figures responsible for the document's release, insisted that the envelope containing the Third Secret had been opened in 2000 and had been kept entirely intact. But then how do we explain other Vatican officials who described multiple documents, different handwritings, and even separate envelopes? These weren't internet conspiracy theorists. These were insiders. And they weren't all in agreement. There's also the matter of Lucia's own statements, what little of them we were allowed to hear. In the years following the 2000 release, she was interviewed several times under tight supervision. In those conversations, she confirmed that she had written what was shown, but never directly stated that it was the full and final secret. Her words were as always cloaked in reverence and caution, almost as if she were trying to obey two masters, the truth and the church. And then, like a candle guttering in the wind, her voice disappeared completely. She died in 2005, just weeks before Pope John Paul II. If she ever left behind another document, another sealed envelope, the world has not seen it. The strange silences continued. In 2007, an Italian journalist named Antonio Socci published a book entitled The Fourth Secret of Fatima. In it, he argued that the Church had released only part of the third secret, possibly the vision, but not the explanation. He noted that multiple cardinals, including Ratzinger and Bertone, had referred to the secret as difficult, terrifying, and disturbing terms that didn't align with the relatively tame imagery of the 2000 document. Why the dramatic language if the prophecy was merely a symbolic scene of martyrdom? Even odder were the shifting timelines. Archbishop Loris Capovilla, secretary to Pope John XXIII, testified that the envelope containing the third secret had been read by the Pope in 1959, yet other Vatican sources said it wasn't opened until 2000. That's a difference of over 40 years. Someone clearly was mistaken, or someone was hiding something. This inconsistency raises a question that remains open to this day. Are we dealing with a partial secret, or a replacement? To answer that, we have to understand the political and spiritual climate of the Church during the mid-20th century. The era of Vatican II, a time when popes were actively reshaping doctrine, liturgy, and the very public image of the Church. If the real third secret contained a dire warning, one that threatened the credibility of the hierarchy itself, would it have been inconvenient, unwelcome, perhaps even dangerous? In that context, the idea of suppressing the message isn't just plausible, it's almost logical. Institutions don't like internal collapse. They prefer external enemies. And when the threat comes from within, it's easier to paint over the cracks than to invite inspection. The real mystery of Fatima is not just what was said, it's what was left unsaid. And as we'll see next, one man claimed to know exactly what had been buried, and he claimed it could destroy the Church from within. In the shadowed corridors of Vatican intrigue, few names spark more fascination or controversy than Malachi Martin. To some, he was a truth-teller, a lone voice crying out in a wilderness of secrecy. To others, a dramatist cloaked in priestly garb, spinning tales for an audience of believers and skeptics alike. But regardless of where you fall, Martin's connection to the Third Secret of Fatima is both haunting and strangely intimate. He didn't just talk about the secret, he claimed to have read it. And he hinted without ever quite confirming that what was released in 2000 was only a shadow of the original. Born in Ireland in 1921, Malachi Martin was a Jesuit priest and biblical scholar who rose through the ranks of the Church, eventually serving as a close aide to Cardinal Augustin Bey, one of the most powerful figures during the Second Vatican Council. Through Bey, Martin was allegedly granted access to high-level discussions and documents normally reserved for the innermost circle. According to Martin himself, it was during this period, sometime in the early 1960s, that he was permitted to read the Third Secret. He never revealed the exact words, but over the next 4 decades he dropped clues, strange shivering fragments that hinted at something more horrifying than any public revelation had ever dared to suggest. During a radio interview in the late 1990s, when asked directly if the Third Secret involved the destruction of Rome and widespread apostasy within the Church, he paused and said only, "I cannot comment." A beat later, with the smooth confidence of a man who wants you to read between the lines, he added, "But that's a fair interpretation." This became Martin's hallmark. He never declared. He implied. He never confirmed. He teased. In a world built on Latin decrees and stamped seals, Malachi Martin played the role of the unreliable narrator, or perhaps the only one telling the truth. Among his most chilling suggestions was the idea that the secret involved a vision of a future pope under the control of Satan. He claimed it spoke of a time when Rome would lose the faith, when the hierarchy would crumble from within, and when a counterfeit church would rise up masquerading as holy, but serving another master entirely. In his words, the Third Secret was not a prophecy of wars or assassinations, but of spiritual corruption at the very highest levels. It was, he said, the smoke of Satan entering the sanctuary. Now, to be fair, Martin was not without theatrics. His books fictionalized accounts of Vatican politics, possession, and power were filled with dramatic flair. His critics accused him of embellishment, of using his priestly credentials to sell thrillers to a credulous audience. Even within the Church, his reputation was mixed. Some viewed him as a defector, others as a prophet in exile. And yet, certain details lend weight to his claims. For one, his timeline matches known historical facts. He said he read The Secret while working with Cardinal Bea, which corresponds with the period during which the envelope was known to be in Rome. He also repeatedly referenced the year 1960, not because he invented it, but because Lucia herself had insisted that the secret must be released by then. That detail alone links Martin's version to the original prophecy, not the sanitized vision revealed 4 decades later. One particularly unsettling moment came during a live radio broadcast in the mid-1990s. A caller asked whether the secret involved a great apostasy and the betrayal of the Church by its own hierarchy. Martin responded, "That's precisely it, and it's worse than you think." He never elaborated. But those 7 words, "and it's worse than you think," have echoed through the corridors of speculation ever since. Of course, skeptics argue that Martin was simply spinning gold from Vatican shadows, that he never saw the secret and merely built a brand from rumor. But if that were true, he took the lie to his grave. He died in 1999, just months before the Vatican released the official version of the Third Secret. Some have found that timing suspicious, others poetic. There's another curious thread. Martin often hinted that the real content of the Third Secret was known to a select group of Vatican officials, popes, cardinals, and perhaps a few theological advisors. But he also suggested that these men were afraid of it, that it was too disturbing, too damaging to be shared publicly. He claimed that one pope fainted upon reading it. Another locked it in his drawer and refused to speak of it again. And then, in one particularly cryptic passage of his novel Windswept House, Martin described a ritual of enthronement, an occult ceremony performed inside the Vatican by rogue clergy inviting in the very powers the Church was meant to resist. Though fictionalized, Martin insisted in interviews that this scene was based on real events, and he tied its timeline disturbingly to the same period the Third Secret was suppressed. Which raises a deeply uncomfortable question. If the secret contained not just a vision, but a warning of infiltration, betrayal, and spiritual decay, wouldn't it be in the Church's interest to conceal it, or perhaps to neutralize it? To this day, Martin remains a polarizing figure. He cannot be summoned to clarify, cannot be cross-examined, cannot be placed neatly into either column, truth or fiction. But his fingerprints are now on the mystery. His testimony, half whisper, half parable, forces us to reckon with the possibility that the Church may have locked away not just a message, but a mirror. One that showed a future too terrible to face. And as we step into that critical year 1960, we'll explore why the Church was warned to open the secret then, and what might have happened behind closed doors when it refused. By now, one particular date has begun to echo like a bell struck just slightly off-key, 1960. It wasn't chosen at random. It wasn't a guess. Sister Lucia, the sole surviving Fatima visionary, explicitly stated that the Third Secret of Fatima should be revealed no later than 1960. When pressed on why she gave only this answer, because it will be clearer then, not because the world will be ready. Not because Rome asked, but because clarity would arrive with that year. So what exactly did she mean? Let's take a moment and step into 1960. The world stood at a crossroads. John F. Kennedy, the first Catholic president of the United States, was on the rise. The Cold War had entered a dangerous new phase. The Berlin Wall was still a year away, but tensions between East and West were flammable. The threat of nuclear war wasn't a cinematic fantasy, it was dinner-table conversation. And in Rome, the Church was bracing for a transformation. Pope John XXIII had already begun to lay the groundwork for what would become the Second Vatican Council, a seismic shift in doctrine, liturgy, and the Church's posture toward the modern world. That same year, Catholic faithful from across the globe waited in anticipation. For decades, they had heard whispers of the Third Secret, that it involved Russia, that it contained a dire warning for the Church, that it might reveal some kind of spiritual catastrophe. Rumors floated like incense through parishes and convents alike. And then, in 1960, when the Vatican was supposed to unseal the envelope, it didn't. Instead, the response came like a glass of cold water on a candle flame. The Vatican announced that it was not opportune to reveal the contents of the secret. No explanation, no delay, no comment from Sister Lucia, just silence. And that silence, it hit like thunder. For those who had waited, fasted, prayed, it was a betrayal. The question became not just what was in the secret, but why the Church would refuse to reveal it. What had changed? What had they seen in that envelope that made clarity something to avoid? Now here's where it gets complicated. Pope John XXIII is often remembered as a reformer, a man of open arms and gentle eyes. But behind that soft exterior was a mind sharply aware of political consequences. If the Third Secret warned of internal betrayal, if it predicted heresy or corruption within the Vatican itself, then its release would have been more than embarrassing. It would have been destabilizing. There's evidence that Pope John did in fact read the secret. According to his personal secretary, Archbishop Loris Capovilla, the Pope opened the envelope in August 1959, read the contents, and then quietly resealed it. The decision not to release it was his alone. And when asked why, he famously replied, "This does not concern my pontificate." A curious phrase. If the vision described a far-off future, why reject it entirely? If it was symbolic, why not explain it? And if it was terrifying, why not warn the flock? Some scholars believe that 1960 was chosen not because of world events, but because of Vatican calendars. That's the year when, traditionally, the Roman Curia begins its long-term planning for papal encyclicals and council deliberations. If the Virgin's message was meant to guide the Church's course, this would have been the strategic moment to act. Instead, the Church turned in the opposite direction. Vatican II would go on to liberalize much of Catholic practice, decentralize traditional authority, and embrace a more ecumenical posture. To the modern faithful, these changes were refreshing, but to traditionalists and to Fatima devotees, it was an earthquake. What if the secret warned against such changes? What if it predicted a loss of faith, a drift into relativism, or even a false sense of peace? That would explain why releasing it in 1960 would have been, as the Vatican claimed, inopportune. Interestingly, this is where the timeline gets almost cinematic in its precision. In 1960, shortly after the Vatican's announcement, Sister Lucia was abruptly silenced. Her public appearances ceased. Her letters were screened. From that point forward, all commentary on the Third Secret came through intermediaries. Many believe she was pressured, perhaps even under vow of obedience, not to speak further about what she had written. That same year, a bishop in Germany publicly stated that he had read the secret and that it concerned a great apostasy in the Church. He was quickly rebuked. His comments disappeared from official records, but the pattern had been set. Whenever someone with access hinted at corruption, betrayal, or crisis within the hierarchy, they were discredited, redirected, or simply ignored. And then there's the oddity of 1960 itself. Because when Sister Lucia said it will be clearer, then she may not have been referring to political events at all. She may have meant that the Church, its structure, its papacy, its very soul, would be in a state where the message finally made sense. That the warning wasn't about the future anymore. That by 1960, the prophecy was already coming true. That interpretation fits eerily well with Malachi Martin's warnings, which we explored previously. He too emphasized the year 1960 as a turning point, the moment when the Church turned its face away from something too difficult to confront. A mirror held up by heaven showing rot inside the marble. Of course, none of this is provable. The Vatican never gave an alternate date for disclosure. No future papacy ever revisited the not opportune phrasing, and the world moved on, at least publicly. But among Fatima scholars and the devout, the year 1960 remains sacred, a black hole of meaning. The moment when the Church, for reasons still unexplained, chose silence over revelation. And as we now move forward in our investigation, we come to a strange and delicate piece of evidence. A phantom envelope, a supposed letter, that may not have matched the one shown in 2000. And the growing suspicion that there were two documents, one released and one quietly buried. You stand before an altar of contradiction, paper ink, and human memory, all trembling under the weight of something that doesn't quite fit. The envelope, or perhaps envelopes that once held the Third Secret of Fatima, have become as legendary as the message itself. Not because they contained words from heaven, but because those words may have changed shape, or vanished, or multiplied. Let's start with what we're told. The document released in June of 2000 came in the form of 4 handwritten sheets, folded but unsealed, presented as the authentic Third Secret, penned by Sister Lucia. It was shown alongside a statement from Cardinal Angelo Sodano and theological commentary from Cardinal Ratzinger, asserting that this vision, the Pope in white, the ruined city, the bullets, was the full content of the long-suppressed secret. But decades earlier, those who were reportedly familiar with the original envelope had described it quite differently. Archbishop Loris Capovilla, personal secretary to Pope John XXIII, was one such witness. According to his own recollections, the original envelope was sealed within another envelope, and both were marked with solemn warnings to be opened by the Holy Father and after 1960. These markings don't appear on the document the Church released in 2000. More unsettlingly, Capovilla claimed that the handwriting on the outer envelope, the second layer of secrecy, was Pope Paul VI, who had stored it personally in his writing desk, rather than with the rest of the Church's archives. In a 2006 interview, Capovilla even recalled a curious moment of confusion when he was asked by Vatican officials about the exact location of the envelope. His answers seemed to differ from theirs, as if they were discussing two different documents. He hesitated, corrected himself, and eventually gave up trying to resolve the discrepancy. A detail too small to matter, perhaps, unless you believe that there were two versions of the third secret, one, a vision, one, a direct message. This theory, while controversial, refuses to die. Multiple independent sources, including Cardinal Bertone, who oversaw the 2000 disclosure, have offered descriptions of the document that conflict with what was ultimately released. In earlier interviews, Bertone mentioned a single page written in the form of a letter. But the public saw 4 pages of vision devoid of introductory or closing text. No greeting, no signature, no sentence structure typical of a letter. So the question begins to twist into a theological riddle: did Sister Lucia write 2 documents? And if so, which one was meant to be the true third secret sister? Lucia herself, prior to 1960, had told more than one bishop that the secret included the words of the Virgin. Yet the 2000 vision contains no speech. It's a vision without voice, a silent film devoid of the moral gravity that might be expected from a celestial warning. That absence, the sound of a divine message swallowed by white noise, suggests something is missing, perhaps even intentionally so. And there's something else. In the Vatican's 2000 press release, they acknowledged that the document came from the archives of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. But insiders have hinted for decades that another version, possibly the real one, was kept in the Pope's personal apartment. Not in the archives, not in the safes of theologians, but under lock and key, passed from pontiff to pontiff, like a whispered confession too devastating to share. That brings us to a strange photograph. In the 1990s, Father Joaquin Alonso, official archivist for Fatima, was granted access to Sister Lucia's writings. He later claimed that the third secret was, in fact, about 25 lines long, matching earlier descriptions given by Vatican officials. Yet the document revealed in 2000 contains over 60 lines. The line count in this case matters because it suggests that the vision and the letter may not be one and the same. A longer document was shown, but the shorter one remains unseen. Alonso's notes, now held tightly by his order, repeatedly described the secret as containing a crisis of faith, even a prediction of internal apostasy. He insisted that the Church's failure to release the true contents was based on fear, not theology. If the faithful were told that their shepherds might one day betray them, what would become of trust? Theories proliferated like candles flickering in a dark chapel. Some suggested that Lucia originally wrote the secret in the form of a personal note to the Pope, and that it included direct commentary from the Virgin Mary, so explosive, so precise, that successive pontiffs chose to withhold it. Others posited that 2 documents were created, one describing the vision, another interpreting it. The Vatican, it is argued, released the former and suppressed the latter. There's also the curious case of Cardinal Silvio Audi, who claimed that when he asked why the secret hadn't been published in 1960, a high-ranking Vatican official replied, "It would terrify the people." Now the imagery in the 2000 vision ruined cities, dead priests, and a slain pope is certainly grim, but terrifying enough to paralyze the church for 40 years. Somehow it doesn't seem to add up, adding a final twist. Cardinal Ratzinger once stated that the secret concerned the dangers threatening the faith and the life of the Christian and therefore the world. He later retracted that tone when the vision was finally released, calling it symbolic. But which was the real assessment, the earlier warning, or the later minimization? This conflict between earlier testimonies and later official statements is the heartbeat of suspicion. It's not about conspiracy, it's about contradiction. And when contradictions pile high in the Vatican, they often point to something buried underneath. And so we're left with a single piercing question. If there was only ever one third secret, why do so many eyewitnesses describe it in such radically different ways? In the next chapter, we step back into the papal chamber of 1959, where Pope John XXIII sat quietly with the sealed envelope in his hands. He read it. He said almost nothing. And then, with deliberate calm, he locked it away. In the heart of the Apostolic Palace, in a quiet room overlooking the ancient streets of Rome, Pope John XXIII unfolded a single sheet of paper that had waited nearly 2 decades for his eyes. It was the Third Secret of Fatima, or at least what Sister Lucia had written down in 1944 under orders and duress, sealed in 2 envelopes and delivered to the Holy See with the solemn instruction that it should be opened no later than 1960. But Pope John didn't wait that long. In August of 1959, according to the careful testimony of Archbishop Loris Capovilla, the Pope unsealed the inner envelope, read its contents, and fell into what witnesses later described as a long, silent meditation. Then, with a calm that struck some as eerie, he folded the letter, resealed it, and placed it back in his desk. The following year, as the world waited for the Vatican to disclose what the Virgin Mary had allegedly entrusted to Lucia, and through her to the world, John XXIII issued a gentle refusal. The message, he said, did not concern my pontificate. It was never published during his lifetime. That phrase, so carefully crafted, so precisely vague, has echoed ever since. What did he mean? Was the message irrelevant? Was it too terrible? Or was he merely choosing not to act on it, believing that whatever storm it described belonged to some future papacy? Some take his words at face value. John was, after all, a pastoral pope, affectionately nicknamed Good Pope John. He sought to modernize the church, open the windows, let in fresh air. Perhaps he saw the Third Secret as a relic of a more apocalyptic mindset, a grim medieval vision that didn't belong in the church he hoped to reform. But others see something more calculated. Because even as John XXIII worked behind the scenes to convene the Second Vatican Council, a sweeping redefinition of the church's identity, he was also rejecting, suppressing, or quietly sidestepping messages that might contradict that vision. The Third Secret, if it did in fact predict internal collapse, doctrinal confusion, or spiritual corruption at the highest levels, would have thrown a dark shadow over the council before it even began. And there's a deeper irony. Pope John's decision not to reveal the secret came at a time when many within the church were clamoring for it. The year 1960 had taken on a mythic significance not just among the laity, but among bishops, clergy, and theologians. Catholic newspapers around the world printed speculative articles. Prayer groups formed in anticipation. Sermons hinted at a coming revelation. When it didn't come, the silence felt more like a scream. What made it worse was the Vatican's refusal to explain. No press conference, no pastoral letter. Just a brief note to the Portuguese bishops stating that the secret was not destined to be revealed. The disappointment rippled across the faithful like a silent wave. Some accepted the decision with quiet faith. Others began to wonder, what are they hiding? There's a compelling detail in Capovilla's own retelling. After reading The Secret, Pope John consulted with a small circle of cardinals and advisors, not theologians known for mysticism or prophecy, but diplomats, bureaucrats, men trained in the politics of Vatican statecraft, not in Marian visions or apocalyptic warnings. The fact that the decision was made in this context through a lens of optics and control suggests that the secret was handled more like a political liability than a spiritual message. And then there's the oddity of Pope John's journal. He was a prolific writer, often reflecting on major events and decisions in his papal diary. Yet when it comes to the Third Secret of Fatima, his entries are cryptic at best. No detailed thoughts, no mention of content. Just a vague pastoral nod to divine providence, as though even his private writings avoided what the message may have contained. Some scholars believe John III feared the destabilizing power of the secret, that its release could have ignited schisms, emboldened traditionalist factions, or undermined the council before it began. If it indeed described betrayal at the top, how could a pope presiding over a revolutionary council be expected to explain that it's possible he believed he was doing the faithful a kindness, that shielding them from fear, controversy, or confusion was part of his role as shepherd? But others argue that the decision marked the beginning of a pattern, a Vatican unwilling to face what it knew. A church that, when warned of fire in the walls, chose to draw the curtains and smile. What followed his rejection was even stranger. The secret was returned to its envelope, some say a different one, and eventually placed in the care of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. There it remained, passed silently from pope to pope. Paul VI read it and said nothing. John Paul II, who only served 33 days before his sudden death, is believed to have read it and made no comment. John Paul II read it after being shot in 1981. He waited nearly 20 years before releasing what the Vatican now claims is the full content. Each of these men handled the secret differently, but none of them released it in 1960 as Sister Lucia had requested, and none of them ever addressed in public why the original timing had been ignored. One detail worth noting again from Capovilla was that Pope John, after reading the secret, placed a hand over the document and simply said, "This is not for our time," a statement as enigmatic as the secret itself. Whose time then was it for? Perhaps he believed that future popes would understand the message more clearly. Or perhaps he knew that the Church would one day face exactly what the secret warned of, and simply didn't want to be the one to say it out loud. And so the silence of Pope John XXIII wasn't just a private choice. It set a precedent, a Vatican policy of delay, deflection, and denial that would stretch across the next 4 decades. And in the vacuum of that silence, the faithful looked for meaning elsewhere. One of the places they found it was in a bullet, in a square, in the collapsing body of a pope dressed in white. And that's where we go next. It happened on May 13, 1981. The date was no coincidence. It was the 64th anniversary of the first Fatima apparition, the moment the Virgin Mary was said to have appeared to 3 children in the Portuguese countryside. That afternoon, Pope John Paul II was being driven through St. Peter's Square in an open-air vehicle. The sun glinted off the cobblestones. Tourists waved flags. Nuns snapped photos. And then, like a lightning strike in slow motion, gunshots rang out. 4 bullets tore through the air. 2 struck the Pope. He collapsed into the arms of his secretary, pale and silent. Blood spread quickly across his white cassock, a slow red bloom against the sacred garment. Panic erupted. Screams filled the square. Cameras jolted. Within minutes, a man was arrested. Mehmet Ali Aka, a Turkish gunman with ties to a mysterious web of radical networks and possible Cold War sponsors. John Paul II very nearly died. 1 bullet missed a major artery by less than a millimeter. Surgeons later described his survival as statistically impossible. He, on the other hand, would call it a miracle. And almost immediately, Fatima returned to center stage. While recovering in the hospital, the Pope reportedly requested the full Fatima dossier. He read the Third Secret, which he had previously viewed only in part. According to Vatican insiders, he became convinced that the message, particularly the vision of a bishop dressed in white being gunned down amidst a ruined city, referred directly to him. In the years that followed, this interpretation hardened into official Vatican narrative. When the Third Secret was finally released in 2000, it was accompanied by a detailed explanation linking the prophecy to the 1981 assassination attempt. The Vatican's position was clear: this was the fulfillment of the secret. Case closed. But there's a problem, or rather several. First, the vision described in the Third Secret doesn't depict a pope who survives. It shows a bishop in white making his way through a devastated landscape, praying for the dead, climbing a hill toward a cross, and then being killed in a hail of bullets and arrows. Not injured, not rescued, not healed, killed. Alongside him, bishops and priests fall one by one. The city lies in ruins. There is no hospital, no recovery, no second act. If this was meant to describe John Paul II's assassination attempt, it's strangely inaccurate. Unless, of course, the vision was symbolic. Unless the bullets weren't bullets. Unless the blood wasn't blood. But then again, why such vivid, brutal imagery if the purpose was to describe a wound that didn't kill the Vatican? Tried to square this by framing the Pope's survival as a divine intervention. In a speech given a year after the attempt, John Paul himself said it was a mother's hand that guided the bullet's path. He believed the Virgin Mary had spared him, that she had deflected the bullet, that the vision foretold not just his suffering, but his salvation. It was in a way his personal miracle. And yet, even he didn't always seem certain that the secret had been fully revealed. In 2000, during the official ceremony in Fatima announcing the disclosure, he said something strange: we would be mistaken to think that Fatima's prophetic mission is complete. A sentence that slipped past most ears at the time. But to those paying attention, it sounded like a quiet contradiction of the Vatican's own narrative. What prophetic mission remains if the prophecy has already come true? It's also worth remembering that when Sister Lucia first wrote The Secret in 1944, she was referencing a future event, not a past one. And she made clear that the content would be clearer by 1960. That's more than 2 decades before the assassination attempt. If The Secret really referred to John Paul II in 1981, why would the Church be instructed to reveal it in 1960? That timing issue has never been resolved. It's the sort of inconsistency that whispers louder than any official explanation. Then there's the issue of what Sister Lucia herself thought. In a handful of highly controlled statements following The Secret's release, she was quoted as affirming the Vatican's interpretation. But every word was filtered through ecclesiastical channels. She was never interviewed freely, never allowed to speak off-script. Some Fatima researchers argue that her agreement was more obedient than authentic, a nod of submission rather than conviction. A key point here is that the original Fatima message, like many prophecies, was not just about events, but about causes. It warned not simply of suffering or violence, but of consequences, of what happens when sin, pride, and betrayal fester in sacred places. The assassination attempt, while dramatic, doesn't fully align with that spiritual warning. It was a political act committed by a foreign gunman, not a sign of internal collapse. It doesn't speak to apostasy. It doesn't indict the church. It was an act against the Pope, not within him. Unless, of course, you believe the church reinterpreted the vision to avoid a more uncomfortable truth. That the third secret was not about physical bullets at all, but about spiritual ones. Wounds inflicted not by assassins, but by cardinals, by bishops, by policies and doctrines and silences too long maintained. If that were the case, then framing the prophecy as fulfilled would serve a tidy purpose. It would wrap the secret in a bow. Allow the Vatican to close the file, defang the vision. It would be convenient. And yet traces of unease lingered. Even after the release, figures within the church, most notably Cardinal Ratzinger, continued to speak cautiously about the secret. He admitted that the vision left much room for interpretation. He conceded that its message remained open to the future. This was not the language of finality. This was the language of a door left ajar. To this day, some believe the Vatican's version was tailored to fit the Pope's narrative, that the vision was reframed, softened, perhaps even selectively edited, to align with a story of survival and redemption rather than destruction and loss. A church still standing, not a church in ruins. But that's not what the vision described. And the discrepancy still haunts the margins of the faithful mind. Because if the prophecy wasn't fulfilled in 1981, then it might still be waiting. Waiting for the bishop in white to walk his final path. Waiting for the ruins to match the vision. Waiting for a silence far deeper than the one we've already endured. And as we move forward, we turn to the man who inherited the vision, next Pope Benedict XVI. A theologian, a scholar, and a pope who, despite presiding over the official interpretation, may have quietly disagreed with it. He was known for his precision, his caution, his softly spoken sentences that carried the weight of entire libraries. Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, was not the kind of man to toss words into the wind. And that's what makes his role in the unfolding riddle of the Third Secret so compelling. Because he helped present the Vatican's official interpretation in 2000. He explained it to the world. And yet, as time went on, he began to say things that didn't quite fit that interpretation. As head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Ratzinger was the Vatican's theological watchdog. It was his job to guard, interpret, and at times strategically withhold church teaching. In June of 2000, he co-authored the commentary that accompanied the release of the Third Secret. Calm, analytical, and filled with biblical citations, his essay framed the vision as symbolic, a meditation on 20th century suffering, the rise of atheistic regimes, and the persecution of the faithful. He concluded that the prophecy had been fulfilled notably in the 1981 assassination attempt on John Paul II. But even within that commentary, there were strange gaps. He admitted, for example, that the vision offered no great mystery, but then added that it remained open to interpretation. A delicate phrase, almost like a warning wrapped in linen, as if he were fulfilling a duty while simultaneously nudging the reader toward deeper inquiry. And then years later, after becoming Pope himself, he said something altogether more provocative. During a pilgrimage to Fatima in 2010, 10 years after the official release, Pope Benedict gave a homily that startled many. Standing beneath the statue of the Virgin, he said, "We would be mistaken to think that the prophetic mission of Fatima is complete. Wait, What if the third secret had already been fulfilled as the Vatican had insisted in 2000? Then what remained? What prophetic mission was still unfolding? The words fell like a subtle stone into still water, and the ripples spread quietly across the church. Some dismissed the comment as poetic flourish, but others, especially those who had long doubted the 2000 disclosure, sat up straighter. And that wasn't the only inconsistency. In private interviews, Ratzinger had previously described the Third Secret in terms that leaned far more apocalyptic than the document ultimately released. In 1984, for example, he told a Jesuit magazine that the secret concerned the dangers which threaten the faith and the life of the Christian and therefore the world. He added that it also spoke of novelties within the church that could lead to spiritual ruin. None of those themes appeared in the vision of the bishop in white walking among corpses. So which Ratzinger should we believe, the cardinal theologian who hinted at theological dangers, the pope who insisted the prophecy wasn't finished, or the author of the commentary that closed the case? That contradiction lies at the heart of what some have called the Benedict puzzle. He seems to straddle two worlds, one public, one private. One obedient to the Vatican's narrative, the other quietly sympathetic to those who suspect that something remains unrevealed. There's a moment easily missed in a 2016 interview between Pope Benedict and German journalist Peter Seewald. When asked directly whether the full Third Secret had been published, Benedict smiled faintly and said yes. But Seewald pressed further, asking whether there might be more. The Pope Emeritus's answer was long careful and strange. He spoke not of secrets, but of spiritual depth. He referenced personal interpretation. And then he said, each person will find what they are looking for. Not quite a denial, not quite a confirmation, but deeply Benedict. And then, of course, there's the elephant in the room. In 2013, Pope Benedict XVI became the first pope in nearly 600 years to resign. He cited age and strength. But some couldn't help but wonder, was the resignation connected to the secret? Had the weight of what he knew and what he perhaps could not say finally become too much? The Vatican predictably denied any connection. And perhaps they were right. Perhaps the reasons were simple, even humble. But for those who follow the Fatima thread, Benedict's resignation sparked uncomfortable echoes. The Third Secret, if it truly warned of internal collapse, may have been brushing closer to fulfillment than anyone wanted to admit. And there was another layer, one that emerged only after Benedict stepped down and Pope Francis took his place. For the first time in modern history, the Church had two popes, one reigning, one retired, one active, one contemplative. But both, it's believed, had read the same secret. This unprecedented situation only deepened the mystery. Did the Third Secret say something about two popes, a divided church, a moment in history, when apostolic succession appeared blurred, doubled, or even fractured? If so, it might explain why Benedict, even in retirement, remained tight-lipped. He still wore white. He still called himself Pope Emeritus. He still lived within Vatican walls. But he never commented again on the Third Secret, as if perhaps he had said just enough, or too much. Critics argue that all this is reading tea leaves, that symbolism is being mistaken for prophecy, that Benedict's comments were merely cautious, not revelatory. But in the realm of secrets, caution is revelation. When a man as careful as Benedict chooses his words so precisely, the spaces between those words begin to glow. And so we're left with a picture of a pope who knows more than he says, who once helped seal the official story, but later gestured toward deeper layers. A pope who may have understood the Third Secret not as a solved riddle, but as a slow-motion warning, still unfolding, still pressing inward. And as we turn the page, we step into the most controversial interpretation of all. The one many believe was the true heart of the message, the one so dangerous, so destabilizing, that it couldn't be uttered aloud. The one that says the real threat is not from the world, but from within the church itself. It begins with a whisper, a subtle shift in tone, a hesitation in the liturgy, a bishop saying something that doesn't quite sound like Catholicism, a seminarian questioning the meaning of dogma, a theologian publishing a book that dances too close to heresy and gets praised for it. Over time, the whispers grow louder, and what once would have been condemned becomes canonized by silence. This is the landscape painted by the great apostasy theory, a chilling interpretation of the third secret that claims the true content of the message warned not of war, not of assassination, but of something far worse. A spiritual collapse, not from the outside, but from the inside. According to this theory, the third secret predicted a time when the Catholic Church would face betrayal not by governments or secular forces, but by its own hierarchy. That a crisis would begin at the top. That cardinals would turn against cardinals. That doctrine would decay not through confrontation, but through corrosion. Soft words replacing hard truths. And over time, the Church would cease to be the guardian of truth and become something else. It's a disturbing idea. But it didn't arise from internet message boards or wild-eyed pamphlets handed out at train stations. It emerged from the lips of people close to the very heart of the Church. In the 1990s, Cardinal Mario Luigi Chiappi, who had served as papal theologian under 5 popes, allegedly confided in friends that the third secret warned of apostasy in the Church beginning at the top. That phrase, beginning at the top, is the one that has haunted Fatima researchers ever since. Because if true, it means that the prophecy didn't simply predict suffering. It predicted betrayal. There's no public document in which Chiappi makes this claim. But the quote has circulated widely, and those who knew him insist he said it. They claim he was troubled in his later years, that he believed the Church had failed to heed the warning, that the silence around the third secret was not just about timing, but about damage control. Now let's not overstep. Apostasy is a strong word. In church teaching, it means a total rejection of the faith. Not doubt, not error, not even heresy, but a full turning away. And to suggest that such a thing could begin within the Vatican itself, that those dressed in robes of authority might one day guide the faithful into darkness, is no small accusation. But the theory has gained traction precisely because of the strange behavior surrounding the third secret's suppression, the delay, the contradictions, the shifting explanations. To many it all smells not of confusion, but of fear, as though the secret said something too dangerous to say out loud. And then there's Sister Lucia's own words. Before her public silence in 1960, she hinted several times that the final message involved a spiritual crisis. In letters and conversations, she mentioned the diabolical disorientation that would enter the Church. A phrase she used often. She never said what that disorientation would look like, but the context made it clear this was not about external enemies. It was about something internal, something creeping like mist through stained glass. Lucia also reportedly said that the devil's final battle would be against the family and the priesthood, 2 pillars of Catholic life. Those comments, long ignored, have since been re-examined in the light of scandals, doctrinal debates, and the increasingly polarized state of modern Catholicism. And it's here, perhaps, that the theory begins to feel less theoretical. In recent decades, the Church has been rocked by crisis after crisis. Sexual abuse scandals, cover-ups, financial corruption, doctrinal confusion, public disagreements between bishops, cardinals openly criticizing the Pope, entire national churches drifting into theological gray zones. For some, it all feels less like coincidence and more like fulfillment. Of course, many within the Church reject the great apostasy narrative outright. They see it as alarmist, destructive, a distraction from the real work of faith. They argue that reform is not apostasy, that debate is not betrayal, that the gates of hell will never prevail. And maybe they're right. But if the Third Secret did warn of a great falling away, then that defense becomes more complicated. Because in prophecy, it's rarely the obvious that carries danger. It's the almost imperceptible shift, the little compromise, the soft replacement of truth with feeling. There are other signs too, fragments buried in the words of recent popes. Paul VI, in a 1972 address, famously said that the smoke of Satan has entered the temple of God, a phrase he never explained, but one that theologians have returned to again and again. What did he mean? Was it metaphor? Or was he pointing subtly to something he couldn't say aloud? John Paul II, when asked about the state of the Church during a visit to Fulda, Germany, reportedly said, "We must prepare ourselves to suffer great trials in the not-too-distant future. Trials that will require us to be ready to give up even our lives, and a total gift of self to Christ and for Christ. Through your prayers and mine, it is possible to mitigate this tribulation, but it is no longer possible to avert it." His words were sobering, but also oddly specific. And then, of course, there's Pope Benedict's quiet refrain. We would be mistaken to think the prophetic mission of Fatima is complete. So if this is apostasy, if this is what the Secret was warning about, then we're not talking about a future crisis. We're living inside of it. That may explain why the Church, faced with such a message, chose silence. Because how does a shepherd tell his sheep that some of the shepherds have gone rogue? And how does a church rooted in truth confess that it might have looked into the mirror of prophecy and seen its own face twisted beyond recognition? But there's more. Because if the crisis is real, then it's not just a matter of theological drift. It becomes a question of leadership, of legitimacy, of whether the very foundation of apostolic succession has remained unbroken. And that's where our next turn takes us, into the controversial claim that the line of popes itself may have been warned about. Some secrets are kept not by walls or locks, but by shared discomfort, an unspoken pact among those who realize that the truth, if spoken plainly, might set too many fires. That's the atmosphere surrounding one of the most frequently whispered names in the Fatima controversy, Cardinal Mario Luigi Ciappi. Not a household name. Not the kind of cardinal whose photo appears in cathedral gift shops. But in his quiet way, Ciappi was closer to the heart of the Church than most will ever be. He served as the personal papal theologian under 5 popes from Pius XIII to John Paul II. That meant it was his job to advise the popes on theological matters of the deepest gravity. He reviewed encyclicals before they were issued. He was responsible for maintaining doctrinal continuity. And he, by his own admission, read the Third Secret of Fatima. Which brings us to the alleged leak. In the 1990s, a letter surfaced reportedly quoting Cardinal Ciappi as having told a confidant that in the Third Secret, it is foretold, among other things, that the great apostasy in the Church will begin at the top. That phrase, "at the top," struck like lightning. Because if true, it directly contradicted the official Vatican narrative that the Third Secret concerned only the 1981 assassination attempt and had been fully revealed in 2000. Now let's be clear. Ciappi never published this statement, It appears in no official document. The letter that quotes him is second-hand, but it has never been publicly or credibly refuted either. And more curiously, neither Chiappi nor the Vatican ever issued a correction or clarification after the quote began circulating. In church diplomacy, silence is often louder than rebuttal. So we must ask, what would it mean if the secret did, in fact, predict apostasy beginning at the very top of the church? It would mean heresy not from the fringe but from the core. It would mean popes, cardinals, bishops, men in mitres and white robes somehow playing a role wittingly or not in the unraveling of truth. That's not an ordinary crisis. That's a theological earthquake. And it would explain much. It would explain why Pope John XXIII, upon reading The Secret in 1959, decided it did not concern his pontificate. A statement that might be interpreted as a refusal to see his role in the warning. It would explain the strange silences of Pope Paul VI, who, after announcing in 1960 that The Secret would not be released, famously declared that the smoke of Satan had entered the church. It would explain the long delay until the year 2000 when the version finally released, stripped of any references to doctrinal danger, seemed so curiously sanitized. If The Secret warned of theological corruption, then suppression would be not just a tactic, but a survival instinct. Consider this: Chiappi was not a conspiracy theorist. He was a consummate insider. His entire vocation was built on precision, clarity, and fidelity to doctrine. He helped shape the Catechism. If he believed The Secret warned of internal collapse, it deserves attention. And there's another thread worth tugging. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Chiappi maintained close contact with theologians outside the Vatican walls. He occasionally commented on the growing crisis of faith sweeping through seminaries, the loss of discipline among clergy, and the rising confusion over fundamental teachings. He never named names, but he didn't have to. His tone spoke volumes. He feared that something had shifted, and not just in the world, but in the sanctuary. This aligns with the writings of Sister Lucia, who described a kind of diabolical disorientation entering the church. It wasn't a single error. It was a clouding of vision, a numbing of conscience, a decay that began not with denial, but with dilution. Chiappi's alleged quote seems to confirm this. It doesn't describe a coup or a public declaration of heresy. It describes a wrought, subtle, slow, and beginning precisely where trust is highest. That's why it's so dangerous. Because if the shepherd leads the flock into the thorns, who is left to pull them out? Naturally, critics argue that all of this is circumstantial. They point out that leaks and rumors swirl around every Vatican mystery, that without direct documentation, Chiappi's alleged statement is just hearsay. And to a degree, they're right. But in the realm of Fatima, everything is hearsay until it's not. That's part of the tragedy. The Secret was delivered to be read, and instead it became a maze of silences, rewordings, and evasions. Every time a new voice speaks up, whether it's Chiappi Ratzinger or a nun in Portugal, it's either absorbed or dismissed by an institution too cautious to be transparent and too burdened to be bold. But the pattern remains, and it grows. A secret too dangerous to reveal in 1960. A pope who reads it and goes silent. A theologian who hints at heresy in high places. A church that after 2 millennia finds itself more divided than ever between those who trust the magisterium blindly and those who wonder whether the wolves have learned to dress like shepherds. This is the tension that the Fatima prophecy continues to press against. Not just what happened, but what might be happening now. If the Third Secret warns of apostasy at the top, then the crisis is no longer a theory. It's a liturgy. And the person who first tried to warn the world, the quiet nun with eyes that had seen fire, was soon after 1960 ushered into the deepest silence of all. Our next chapter explores that silence, not just her retreat from public life, but the growing suspicion that someone else was speaking for her. She was the last living witness, the keeper of a vision she didn't ask for, a woman whose life, once touched by light in a Portuguese field, would become defined by shadows. Sister Lucia dos Santos, later Sister Maria Lucia of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart, was the soul of the Fatima mystery. And as the Church's silence deepened after 1960, so did hers. But here's the question that continues to trouble researchers, theologians, and even faithful lay Catholics. Did Lucia choose silence of her own accord? Or was it imposed on her to answer that we need to understand who she became? After the final Fatima apparition in October 1917, Lucia remained in the public eye for a few years. She gave statements, met with clergy, and slowly adjusted to the strange life of a teenage mystic. But by 1928, at the age of 21, she entered the Dorothean Sisters, a life of religious service, of prayer, solitude, and obedience. Her spiritual superiors quickly understood that her fame was both a blessing and a burden. Requests for interviews flooded in. Letters from around the world arrived by the dozen. Some were simply devotional. Others demanded information, clarification, predictions, warnings. Lucia became less of a person and more of a spiritual cipher. So in 1948, with the Church's quiet approval, she transferred into the Carmelite order, a more cloistered, more silent existence. She entered the Carmel of Saint Teresa in Coimbra, Portugal, where she would remain for the rest of her life. From that moment on, Lucia would only be heard through others. Public access to her was restricted. Private letters were vetted. Interviews required special permission. All questions, especially those regarding the Third Secret, had to be submitted through ecclesiastical channels. Over time, it became difficult to know whether her words were her own or filtered through layers of authority. In the early 1950s, just before the fateful year of 1960, she made several statements that now carry eerie weight. She warned of a great chastisement, a coming crisis within the Church. She emphasized the need for penance for the Rosary, for the consecration of Russia. And she reiterated more than once that the Third Secret must be released by 1960. Because then, she said, it will be clearer. But after 1960, her tone changed. Or rather, it vanished. When the Vatican chose not to publish the Third Secret that year, Lucia made no public comment. Not one. No clarification. No disagreement. No lament. She was simply quiet. And this silence was not accidental. According to her own letters, she had submitted the text of the Third Secret to her bishop in 1944. From that moment, she believed the responsibility to disclose it lay with the Pope. But believing that doesn't require her to agree with their silence. And yet, for the next 45 years, she never publicly criticized the Vatican's handling of the secret. Was that obedience, or was it censorship? The distinction matters. In 1992, a priest who had worked with Lucia in her early years revealed that even before 1960, she had been warned not to speak too freely. There are things she was allegedly told that the Church must reveal in her own time. After that, Lucia became more reserved, even wary. Some believe she feared that speaking out would be viewed as rebellion. Others argue that she genuinely deferred to the Church's wisdom, even if it went against her own instincts. Still, her silence created a vacuum. And vacuums attract interpretation. Some point to the carefully curated statements issued in her name after 2000. Following the Vatican's publication of the Third Secret, Lucia confirmed in a typed, unsigned statement that the vision matched what she had written. But Fatima researchers were quick to note the phrasing. The language was vague, impersonal, clinical. It didn't sound like Lucia, and more curiously, Lucia never appeared in person to confirm the Vatican's version. No public testimony, no interview, not even a video or photograph of her holding the released document. For someone who had written the original, her detachment was striking. Then came the rumors. In the years after the 2000 release, whispers began to circulate that Lucia had been prevented from speaking freely, that even her family had trouble contacting her, that visitors to her convent were carefully screened, monitored, and in some cases gently redirected away. It's important not to overreach. Lucia was not a prisoner. She lived a life of contemplative prayer. She received visitors. But the pattern was clear. The more the world demanded answers, the more unreachable she became. And then in 2005 she died. Her funeral was dignified, reverent, and yet for many it marked the sealing of a vault. The last living connection to the original vision was gone. And with her passing, the possibility of hearing the full, unfiltered truth seemed to fade like incense into a cold marble dome. There are those who believe Lucia remained silent, not out of fear, but out of trust. That she believed God would reveal what needed to be revealed in His own time. That her silence was protective of the faithful of the Church, even of the message itself. But others believed the silence was imposed, that she was managed, that her statements, especially after 1960, were written not by her, but for her, and that the woman who once saw the sun dance and the earth open its mouth had become little more than a sacred figurehead in a Vatican-controlled narrative. Either way, the silence was deafening. It left a vacuum the Church never quite filled. And into that vacuum stepped a theory even more shocking than any before, that what we were shown in 2000 was only part of the message. That the third secret, as terrifying as it might be, had been split. Which leads us into the next and most whispered claim of all the possibility, that there was not one secret, but two. It's the kind of theory that should collapse under its own weight. A fourth secret of Fatima. That's not what the records say. That's not what Lucia wrote. That's not what was promised. And yet, here we are. Because after the Vatican released the vision in 2004 pages, describing a bishop in white, a ruined city, corpses in the dust, and arrows flying through the air, something didn't sit right. Not with scholars, not with priests, not with those who had spent decades tracing every comma of the Fatima testimonies. The questions began like a breeze but built into a windstorm. Why did the document contain no direct words from the Virgin Mary? Why didn't it match earlier descriptions from people who claimed to have read it? And why, despite the fanfare of its release, did even high-ranking clerics like Cardinal Ratzinger hint that the prophecy wasn't quite over? Enter the so-called fourth secret. Let's get the name out of the way first. It's misleading. There was no official fourth message in the original Fatima revelations. The Virgin Mary gave the children one secret in 3 parts: Hell War and the final mystery. But what if the third part wasn't one document, but 2? That's what the fourth secret theory proposes. That the third secret of Fatima had 2 components, a vision and a message. And that the vision, the bishop in white, was released in 2000. But the message, the actual interpretation of the vision, the part where the Virgin Mary explains what it means, has never been shown. If true, the so-called fourth secret isn't a new prophecy at all. It's the suppressed half of the original. One of the earliest and loudest proponents of this idea was the Italian journalist Antonio Socci. A mainstream conservative Catholic, Socci initially believed the Vatican's release was complete. He even supported it. But something didn't sit right. The more he read, the more he interviewed insiders, the more he began to suspect that the public had been given only half of the truth. In 2006, Socci published a book titled Il Quarto Segreto di Fatima, the Fourth Secret of Fatima. In it, he laid out the case that two separate texts existed, one describing the symbolic vision and another in which the Virgin herself spoke. This second text, he argued, included specific warnings about apostasy in the Church, a collapse of faith at the highest levels, and possibly even a false pope. Sochi cited interviews, testimonies, and the behavior of key Vatican figures. For example, multiple witnesses before 2000 had described the Third Secret as being 1 page long. The released version, by contrast, spans 4 pages. Sister Lucia herself had once said she wrote the secret in the form of a letter. But what was shown to the public has no salutation, no structure, no closing, no voice. It's not a letter. It's a silent film. And silence in prophecy is often where the danger lies. More evidence for a missing document came from Archbishop Loris Capovilla, Pope John XXIII's personal secretary. Capovilla once referenced a second envelope containing a text distinct from the vision, and in a 2006 interview, when asked if there were 2 texts, he did not deny it. He simply said, "I'm not in a position to answer." A strange phrase from someone who had spent years literally filing the Pope's most personal papers. There were also the Vatican's own verbal gymnastics. Cardinal Bertone, the man who spearheaded the 2000 release, repeatedly stated that the vision was the entire content of the secret. But when pressed on whether a second explanatory document existed, he used careful phrasing, never denying, but always returning to the word vision. And in a televised interview, when asked point-blank if Lucia had written anything else regarding the Third Secret, he smiled and said no comment. That alone would be suspicious. But it's the timing that raises eyebrows. If the Church had a text in which the Virgin Mary allegedly speaks of spiritual collapse within the Vatican itself, would they release it in the wake of doctrinal reforms during theological unrest, in the shadow of sexual abuse scandals? During a period when Catholic identity itself feels at times fractured? Or would they do what institutions often do when cornered? They'd release the quiet part, the blurry part, the part they could frame as already fulfilled, and they'd keep the sharper words locked away. Supporters of the Fourth Secret theory also point to how tightly Sister Lucia was controlled after 1960. She was never allowed to confirm the released document in person. No interview, no press conference, no moment where she said with her own voice, "Yes, this is it." All confirmations came through typed documents filtered through church officials. All of them used passive, vague phrasing. Never once did she hold the document up and say, "These are the words of the Virgin." And so the whisper grows. What if the real Third Secret, the full terrifying message, was never intended to be symbolic at all? What if it named names? What if it described a moment of global spiritual confusion when the world would look to Rome and find not clarity, but contradiction? Of course, the Vatican has dismissed such claims. Bertone called the Fourth Secret theory absurd. Ratzinger, while more nuanced, maintained that the 2000 release contained the heart of the message. But neither man ever addressed the inconsistencies in document length, structure, or content. They simply moved on. But the faithful haven't. Because if even part of the Virgin's message remains hidden, it changes everything. It reopens the question of trust. It casts doubt not just on a document, but on the entire machinery that controls what gets shown and what doesn't. And it makes you wonder what else has been buried. In the next section, we pull back from the pages and look at the landscape itself. What was happening inside the Church at the very moment the Third Secret was supposed to be revealed? What shift occurred just after 1960? We move now into the heart of the 20th century transformation of Catholicism and the quiet collapse that followed. It was called aggiornamento, a bringing up to date, a refreshing breeze through ancient halls. When Pope John XXIII announced the Second Vatican Council in 1959, the world was told to expect renewal. A church no longer speaking only in Latin, a mass more accessible, a posture more open to other faiths, other cultures, modernity itself. But behind the beautiful banners and wide smiles of Vatican II was a quieter, stranger unease, an anxiety that the foundations were not simply being polished, but reshaped, and perhaps just maybe hollowed. The council convened from 1962 to 1965, involving over 2,000 bishops from around the world. It produced 16 major documents, each touching a different aspect of Catholic life. Liturgy was transformed. Ecumenism was encouraged. A more pastoral tone was adopted in how the Church addressed the world. Gone were the thunderous condemnations of heresies. In came a softer, more diplomatic voice. To many, it felt like the Church was finally waking up. But to others, it felt like something sacred was slipping through the cracks. And if the Third Secret of Fatima truly contained a warning about apostasy, corruption, or doctrinal decay from within, then Vatican II may have represented the precise moment that prophecy began to unfold, not through some malicious intent, but through the soft logic of compromise. What made this transformation so jarring was its suddenness. For centuries, the Church had been a bastion of tradition, slow to change and fiercely resistant to modern pressures. Now, within just a few years, altar rails were removed. Gregorian chant faded. Latin disappeared from the pews. Priests turned to face the people. And behind the scenes, theological debates, once tightly controlled, began to bleed into public discourse. The faithful were not prepared. In the years following the council, a wave of confusion swept through parishes. Catechesis grew uneven. Seminaries emptied. Vocations declined. Religious orders shrank. Lay people unsure what to believe anymore began quietly drifting away. Some called it liberation, others disorientation. Sister Lucia herself, though silent on the council's specifics, is reported to have referred often to diabolical disorientation, a phrase she used to describe the spiritual confusion she perceived in the Church after the 1960s. While careful not to criticize any pope directly, her letters at times carried the tone of quiet alarm. She spoke repeatedly of a crisis in faith, a need for prayer, sacrifice, penance more than ever before, and it wasn't just her. In 1973, in Akita, Japan, a nun named Sister Agnes Sasagawa reported visions of the Virgin Mary that bore striking similarities to Fatima. These messages, officially approved by the local bishop, included an explicit warning. The work of the devil will infiltrate even into the Church in such a way that one will see cardinals opposing cardinals, bishops against other bishops. The Virgin's voice in Akita claimed that churches would be compromised, and that the Church will be full of those who accept compromises. It was a stark echo of the Fatima themes, only this time more direct. Meanwhile, the papacy itself seemed to buckle under the weight of the changes it had unleashed. Pope Paul VI, who shepherded the council to completion, later confessed to a deep inner conflict. In 1972, he said bluntly, "We believed that after the council, a sunny day in the Church's history would dawn. But instead, there came a day of clouds and storm and of darkness. Through some fissure, the smoke of Satan has entered the temple of God." That phrase, the smoke of Satan, has haunted the Church ever since. It was never fully explained, but it suggested something deeply troubling, that the enemy had not come from without, but from within. That the sacred had been compromised not by violence, but by subtle infiltration. And yet no one said what that meant. Was it a reference to confusion in doctrine, to moral relativism, to a church that had become more bureaucratic than holy? Or was it, as some now argue, the first public hint that something in the Third Secret had come true? The fallout of Vatican II wasn't just spiritual, it was structural. In the decade following the council, over 100,000 priests left the ministry. Seminaries closed. Mass attendance dropped dramatically in Europe and North America. Religious identity, once inherited like a birthright, began to fracture. To many faithful Catholics, it felt like a disintegration. But perhaps the most painful part was the silence from above. The hierarchy refused to acknowledge any kind of collapse. They pointed to the council's intentions, to the documents, to the spirit of reform. But the pews kept emptying. The churches kept closing. The scandals began to bloom, still hidden behind pastoral smiles. In that silence, Fatima re-emerged. The faithful began to wonder, was this the crisis Lucia saw? Was this the moment the Virgin warned of, not war, not famine, not natural disaster, but a soft apocalypse, a hollowing from within, a collapse of meaning? And if that's true, then the Third Secret wasn't a riddle, it was a roadmap. A quiet one, yes. A whispered one. But one that told of a church that would one day look very much like the one we see now, divided, disoriented, uncertain of its voice, and unsure whether to protect its sacred traditions or move with the cultural tide. And if you believe that, then the suppression of the Third Secret begins to look less like mystery and more like strategy. Because if the faithful had been told in 1960 that the hierarchy itself would fall into error, what would they have done? How would they have reacted to Vatican II? To liturgical change, to the rising theological ambiguities, would they have obeyed or would they have rebelled? Perhaps the Vatican didn't want to find out, but if the Fatima warning was about doctrinal collapse, then its voice may still be echoing through our churches today, sometimes in silence, sometimes in confusion, sometimes in a pope's whisper that something is wrong, even if he cannot say what. And deep in the bowels of the Vatican, there are rumors of more than one document sealed away, of prophecies still unread, of a message too explosive to be carried by a single nun. In the next section, we descend into the very place where such documents would be hidden, the vast, guarded underworld of papal secrecy. The Vatican Archives. There is a door in Rome that does not open without permission. Behind it, a private world unfurls miles of shelving, tens of thousands of tomes, a maze of shadowy alcoves, and ancient volumes that stretch further than the human eye can follow. This is the Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive. And despite the name change, likely a public relations maneuver, the secrecy has not changed. If there is any place on earth where lost prophecies, sealed warnings, or dangerous messages might lie forgotten by the public, but not by power, it is here. The archive is immense, over 50 miles of shelving accessible only to carefully vetted scholars and officials. Even then, not everything is available. There are classified sections, time-locked files, papal permissions that require months or even years to secure. And for some documents, no amount of paperwork will suffice. They are simply off-limits. Period. Among these restricted materials, many believe lie the unspoken records of Marian apparitions. Messages given to visionaries that never saw the light of day. Reports by Vatican emissaries who investigated strange occurrences. And yes, perhaps pages that contain the other half of the Third Secret of Fatima, or even additional prophecies not yet known to the public. You might assume this sounds like mere speculation, a late-night thriller plot. But the Vatican's long history of collecting and concealing apocalyptic material is well documented. One such precedent lies in the prophecy of the popes, attributed to Saint Malachy in the 12th century. Though its authenticity is debated, the list of papal mottos supposedly predicted every pope from the 12th century through to a mysterious Peter the Roman, a final figure during a time of destruction. The manuscript lost for centuries only resurfaced in the Vatican in the late 1500s, or so we're told. The Church has always taken prophecy seriously. So seriously, in fact, that it often investigates privately and then silences what it deems too disruptive. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, formerly known as the Inquisition, still monitors Marian apparitions to this day. But once their findings are filed, they vanish into the archive. One former Vatican archivist, speaking anonymously in a 2009 interview, claimed that the shelves hold far more than diplomatic letters and papal bulls. There are testimonies from exorcists, reports from bishops warning of supernatural phenomena, diaries from popes themselves filled with cryptic reflections on dreams and visions they never revealed. A chilling suggestion followed that some popes may have received private revelations and chosen not to act or chosen to record them only for their successors, which raises a darker question. If the Third Secret, or something like it, did speak of the Church's eventual destruction, what if it was only one of many? What if there's a collection? And what if those warnings were never meant for the public at all? Adding to this atmosphere of concealment is the curious fact that Pope Benedict XVI, when asked about the Third Secret during his time as Cardinal Ratzinger, offered a deeply cryptic statement. He said that the secret concerned dangers threatening the faith and life of the Christian and therefore of the world, and that it involved novissimi, a term referring to the last things, death, judgment, heaven, and hell. That's eschatological language of the end. And yet when the vision was released in 2000, it said nothing of heaven or hell. Nothing of judgment. Only a strange, symbolic scene, a bishop climbing a mountain, walking through ruins, and falling beneath a hail of bullets and arrows. There is no mention of the end of the world. So what was Ratzinger talking about? Unless, of course, there was more. Reports persist of a second, shorter document, perhaps one page folded and sealed, stored separately, written in Lucia's own hand in the form of a personal letter. That's the one that many believe was buried deeper in the Vatican than we were ever meant to look. Even Malachi Martin, the Vatican insider turned novelist, once hinted in an interview that he had seen a document so explosive, so direct, that its release would cause mass panic. He never published it. He said he was bound by oath. But when asked if the document predicted the end of the Catholic Church as we know it, he didn't hesitate. He said yes. Interestingly, Martin claimed the full secret was housed not in the archive itself, but in a place called the Pope's private office. A chamber attached to the papal apartment, where only the pontiff and his closest aides are permitted. There, he said, were safe boxes containing the Church's most sensitive secrets, and among them a small envelope marked Strictissimi Confidentiae, of the strictest confidence. Of course, Martin is a controversial figure, but his statements align with a pattern of evasive language from the Vatican itself. When asked why certain documents remain sealed, Vatican officials often refer to the need to protect the faithful from despair, scandal, or misinterpretation. But what if that desire to protect has transformed into a habit of concealment? The archive doesn't exist in a vacuum. It sits at the heart of a global faith that has endured persecution, schism, and war. Its guardians understand the psychological power of prophecy. A warning about doctrinal collapse, or a false pope, or internal betrayal could split the faithful in half. Better perhaps to withhold, to pray privately, to shepherd in silence. And yet every year the hunger grows. Pilgrims visit Fatima with their own theories, their own hopes, their own fears. Scholars reanalyze Lucia's letters looking for hidden phrases or slips. Conspiracy theorists post blurry images of alleged leaked pages. But through it all, the Church remains mostly still, a silence that feels less like ignorance and more like deliberate waiting. Is the secret locked in a vault, hidden in a drawer, memorized and passed from pope to pope like a sacred burden? We don't know. But we do know this: the Church has a long memory, and it remembers what happened when Galileo's discoveries were mishandled, when Luther's accusations were ignored, when reform was resisted too long. Perhaps it believes that silence now is wiser than controversy, but if the warnings are true, then one day the silence will not be enough. In the next section, we examine one of the oldest and most foundational aspects of Catholicism itself, the unbroken line of apostolic succession. Because if the prophecy in Fatima speaks of an ending, perhaps it begins with the chain that was never supposed to break. It is one of the pillars of the Church, the idea that every pope, every bishop, every priest traces their spiritual authority back to the very beginning, to Peter the Rock, the fisherman turned apostle, the one whom Christ in the Gospel of Matthew declared, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." That unbroken line, that sacred chain of succession, has long been the Church's guarantee of legitimacy. No matter what happens in the world, no matter the wars or the scandals, the apostolic thread is said to endure, pulled tight across centuries. But what if it doesn't? What if somewhere along that ancient chain a link quietly snapped? It's an idea so heretical that few even dare to whisper it aloud. But within certain corners of the Fatima investigation, there is a chilling suggestion that the hidden prophecy may have warned of a disruption, a falsification, even a corruption within the line of succession itself. A false shepherd, or worse, an era when the throne of Peter would be occupied by someone who was not truly his spiritual descendant. To understand this fear, we must briefly revisit a well-established piece of history. In the late 14th century, the Catholic Church entered what's now known as the Western Schism. For nearly 40 years, there were two, and at one point 3 rival popes, each claiming legitimacy. Rome had a pope, Avignon had a pope, and eventually Pisa too. The faithful were split. No one knew which man truly carried the authority of Peter. It was chaos. It shattered confidence. It forced councils to intervene. Eventually, the schism was healed, but not without lasting wounds. And yet, even in that time, there was at least a paper trail. Each pope could argue succession from prior appointments, flawed though the logic may have been. Now fast forward to modern times. After the release of the Third Secret in 2000, at least the version the public was given, many noticed a curious silence on doctrinal matters. No mention of faith, no mention of heresy. But other sources, particularly those who claimed access to the real text, consistently spoke of one word: apostasy. Not just among the laity, not even just among priests, but at the very top. Cardinal Mario Luigi Chiappi, who served as theologian to 5 popes, is alleged to have said in a private letter that in the Third Secret, it is foretold, among other things, that the great apostasy in the Church will begin at the top. A staggering claim, if true, because that would mean not just doctrinal confusion, but a spiritual betrayal embedded within the hierarchy itself. And here's where the theory darkens. If apostasy begins at the top, does that imply that one day the man called Pope might not be guiding the flock at all, but misleading it? Could there be, in the language of medieval prophecy, a false pope, a usurper, a man enthroned not by divine calling, but through political maneuvering or even darker forces. This brings us to an obscure, often overlooked piece of Fatima lore. Some researchers, especially those with connections to traditionalist movements within the Church, point to a vision reportedly described, but never officially published, by Sister Lucia. In it, she allegedly saw a pope under the control of Satan, surrounded by corrupt cardinals navigating a church filled with smoke and confusion. The source of this claim is debated. Some say it was fabricated. Others insist it was quietly suppressed by the Vatican. Either way, the imagery lingers. And so does a phrase found in private writings from a former Fatima archivist who wrote, "There may come a day when the faithful will not know if the man who wears white is Peter's heir or an echo." That word echo suggests a hollow imitation, a form without substance. Theologically, the implications are dizzying. Because apostolic succession isn't just symbolic. It is, according to Catholic teaching, the vessel through which sacramental authority flows. If that chain is broken, then the Church's foundation is in question. Baptisms may be valid, but masses, confessions, ordinations, without the right authority, they risk being reduced to gestures. Of course, no official Church document has ever affirmed this fear. The popes have never hinted at a rupture in the chain. But they have spoken of troubling times. Pope Paul VI's lamentation of the smoke of Satan. Pope John Paul II's private remarks that the Church must pass through a final test. Pope Benedict XVI's resignation, an event so unprecedented in modern times that it led many to speculate whether something beyond age and frailty prompted it. The Church has always taught that the gates of hell shall not prevail. But that doesn't mean the gates won't try. And in the shadow of such prophecy, even well-intentioned reforms can feel suspect. When liturgies are rewritten, when teachings are softened, when traditions are set aside. Are these developments the result of sincere pastoral care or signs of infiltration? This tension lies at the heart of many schisms and pseudo-schisms today. Sedevacantists, a fringe group within Catholicism, argue that the papal seat has been vacant since the reforms of Vatican II because they believe the true apostolic authority has been lost. The mainstream Church rejects this entirely. But the fact that such views even exist and persist suggests a deep uncertainty within the faithful. And what if the Third Secret had acknowledged that possibility? What if it warned not of a loss of buildings or wealth, but a spiritual disconnection from the past? A moment when the visible Church no longer mirrored the mystical one. When Peter's throne became more stage than altar. The idea is terrifying, because if it's true, it would mean the collapse has already begun. Not with explosions, but with silence, with confusion, with well-meaning gestures that slowly unmoor the Church from its ancient roots. And if that's the case, then the next chapter in this prophecy might already be playing out. In the next section, we examine a moment that shook the Church to its core, not with scandal or doctrine, but with something unthinkable, a pope who willingly stepped down. And the emergence of something never before seen in Catholic history, a two-pope era. It began with an announcement so quiet, so soft-spoken, that many within the Vatican press corps didn't realize what they were hearing. On February 11, 2013, Pope Benedict XVI, scholar, conservative, quiet guardian of orthodoxy, stood before a small room and spoke in Latin. As he concluded, a hush fell over the room, then gasps. He had just done something that hadn't been done in nearly 600 years. He was resigning, not dying in office, not abdicating under pressure, simply stepping down. To the world outside, it looked like an act of humility, a man old and tired acknowledging his limitations. But within certain circles, especially among those who had long speculated about Fatima, and its mysterious third secret alarm bells rang. Because Benedict's resignation wasn't just unexpected, it was unprecedented in the modern era. The last pope to resign, Gregory XIII, did so in 1415 to resolve a church split. Before him, Celestine V, a sainted hermit pope, resigned after only 5 months, driven by a desire to return to solitude. Benedict XVI, by contrast, had spent his entire papacy upholding tradition. He was not impulsive, he was not unprepared. So why would he make such a radical move, especially knowing what came next? In the days following the announcement, speculation surged. Some suggested health reasons. Others hinted at a desire to let a younger man face the growing pressures of a global faith. But then came the twist. Benedict didn't return to being Cardinal Ratzinger. He became Pope Emeritus. He kept the white cassock. He stayed within the Vatican walls. He kept his papal ring broken ceremonially, yes, but symbolically still present. And he pledged unconditional obedience to whoever succeeded him. This arrangement was meant to be tidy, clean. But spiritually, it raised an impossible question. Can there be 2 popes? Of course, only one reigned, Pope Francis. But the optics, the symbolism, the subtle theological ripple effects, these couldn't be ignored. Images of the 2 men together dressed in white, both titled, "Your Holiness," circulated widely. The faithful were confused. Which one was Peter's true heir? Some Vatican insiders tried to laugh it off. But the more traditional branches of Catholicism weren't amused. They saw in this duality a possible echo of Fatima's veiled warnings. A pope in exile, a hidden shepherd. Or worse, 2 men bearing the keys of Peter, but only one truly holding them. Among the most controversial theories emerged one that still lingers in certain circles, that Benedict's resignation wasn't entirely voluntary. That pressure, spiritual or political, had been applied. That behind the gentle scholar's face, a reluctant decision had been made to step aside and allow in something else. Supporters of this theory often point to the so-called Vatileaks scandal that rocked the final years of Benedict's papacy. His personal butler was caught leaking documents. Internal corruption, financial mismanagement, and infighting among the Curia all seemed to boil over at once. There were whispers, never confirmed, that Benedict had seen things too vast, too sinister to control. And rather than fight a battle he couldn't win, he withdrew. But if he was the last pope fully committed to preserving the old ways, what did his departure signify? In the quiet corners of Catholic prophecy circles the concept of a bishop in white arises again. In Lucia's vision, publicly released in 2000 but written decades earlier, she describes a bishop dressed in white who walks through a ruined city stepping over corpses. The vision ends with his martyrdom. The Vatican interpreted this figure as John Paul II, referencing the assassination attempt in 1981. But others note that Lucia never identified the bishop as a pope, only as someone who seemed to be. Is it possible, some ask, that Lucia was seeing 2 popes, one who held the title and one who held the authority? Theologically, the Church insists that there is only one pope at a time. But the presence of a living Pope Emeritus complicates this. Benedict continued to write. He continued to speak, though carefully. In one particularly cryptic moment, he said, "The Lord wins in the end." A reassuring phrase, or a veiled reference to something darker he had witnessed during his reign. He never publicly contradicted Pope Francis. But silence, too, can be powerful. And then in January 2023, he died. With his death, the era of 2 popes ended. But the questions remained. Why had he stepped down? What had he seen? And was his resignation part of a larger arc, one that began in a field in Portugal in 1917 with a warning about internal collapse. The theory that the Third Secret warns of a false pope, a deception at the highest level, gains traction among those who view the dual papacy as more than coincidence. They see it as a signal, a disruption in the line, a deviation in the ancient current of succession. And though mainstream Catholicism rejects such speculation, the timing of the resignation combined with the political turbulence within the Vatican at the time continues to inspire unease. Was Benedict the last of an era or the first to face something so dire that stepping down was the only way to preserve the Church, even at the cost of tradition? One clue lies in his writings before he became Pope. As Cardinal Ratzinger, he once said that the Church would become smaller, more faithful, but less influential. He foresaw a purification, a Church stripped of power driven back to its spiritual roots. But to those steeped in prophecy, that sounds less like reform and more like collapse. In the next chapter, we turn our gaze to the man who followed Benedict, the quiet, smiling figure of Pope Francis, beloved by many, controversial to some, and noticeably silent when it comes to Fatima. Has he read the full Third Secret? And if so, why hasn't he said a word? He's known as the People's Pope, a humble man from Argentina taking the name Francis to honor a saint of the poor. He rides in a modest Fiat. He washes the feet of prisoners. He tweets about climate change and kindness. But in all his years on the throne of Peter Pope, Francis has never, not once, spoken publicly about the Third Secret of Fatima. Not a word. And that silence is deafening. Because Francis, despite his reputation as an open communicator, has not shied away from controversy. He's challenged the traditionalists, opened conversations about divorced Catholics, interfaith dialogue, even same-sex civil unions. He's offered informal interviews, off-the-cuff sermons, even remarks on airplanes that leave the curia scrambling. But the one topic where he offers nothing, the one prophecy that shook the Church for nearly a century, silence. It's not that he hasn't been asked. In the early years of his papacy, journalists brought it up. Cardinals were questioned. The press searched for signs. After all, Fatima had been a major milestone for his predecessors. John Paul II was obsessed with it. Benedict edited and released its secrets. Even Paul VI made a pilgrimage to the shrine. Francis visited Fatima too. In 2017, for the centenary of the apparitions, he canonized the two youngest visionaries, Jacinta and Francisco. He prayed, he smiled, he waved to the crowds. But when it came time to address the Third Secret, he said, nothing. There was no public reaffirmation of the Vatican's 2000 release. No clarification, no denial. Just a speech about hope, about peace, and about the need to avoid pessimism. This silence has led some to speculate that Francis either doesn't believe in the secret or knows more than he's allowed to say. And that's where the tension begins. Historically, popes have had a complicated relationship with prophecy. The Church doesn't officially consider private revelations like Fatima to be part of required belief. Catholics aren't obliged to accept them. But they're also not denied outright, especially when the Church has approved the apparition, as it did with Fatima. So why wouldn't a pope comment on one of the most famous prophecies of the 20th century, especially one supposedly fulfilled through the survival of his own predecessor? Here's where things take an uncomfortable turn. There are those scholars, journalists, even priests who believe that Pope Francis does know the full content of the Third Secret. That he read it perhaps as early as his days as archbishop, or more likely during the early months of his papacy. And that he chose silence not out of indifference, but out of necessity. Some claim he is the Pope described in the prophecy. Others go further, suggesting that his rise to power was part of what the prophecy warned about, that the apostasy hinted at in hidden documents is now unfolding under his watch, that reforms under Francis, no matter how compassionate they seem, are unraveling sacred tradition. Of course, these claims are explosive and deeply divisive. Within the Church, there is now a fault line between those who see Francis as a visionary and those who see him as the final storm. His efforts to decentralize authority, to open debate on morality, to shift the focus of the Church from dogma to dialogue, all of these are hailed by progressives and feared by conservatives. To the latter, Francis's silence on Fatima is not benign, it's strategic. They point to his emphasis on synodality on bishops' conferences, making local decisions as a potential path to fragmentation. They reference his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which barely mentions Jesus by name. They cite his calls for a new theology of women without ever defining what that means. They ask, is this pastoral care or doctrinal drift? But perhaps the most unsettling piece of evidence lies in what hasn't happened. If the 2000 release of The Third Secret was truly the full and final version, why not reaffirm it? Why not close the door once and for all? Why leave it open? Francis has had ample opportunity to do just that. He's led Marian devotions. He's praised the Rosary. He's mentioned Fatima in passing. But he has never ever spoken of the Third Secret with the kind of certainty or clarity that his predecessors did. Some claim he doesn't want to reignite old debates, that he seeks unity, not division, that dredging up apocalyptic visions would distract from his mission of mercy. But others think differently. They believe that Francis's silence is the most telling statement of all, that it echoes louder than words, that he knows what the real secret says, and fears what it would unleash if the world knew. There is even a strange symbolic detail that fuels these fires. On May 13, 2017, during the Fatima Centennial Mass, Pope Francis placed a golden rose before the statue of Our Lady. A gesture of reverence, yes, but one that in certain cultures symbolizes mourning. An acknowledgement of beauty lost. Faithful traditionalists took it not as celebration, but as lament. If the Third Secret warned of internal betrayal, and if that betrayal is already underway, then the Pope's silence might not be avoidance. It might be complicity, or worse, acceptance. And yet others argue something far more nuanced. That perhaps Francis does believe in the prophecy, but interprets it as a call to spiritual transformation, not apocalyptic collapse. That his reforms are the answer to the warning, not its fulfillment. But here we circle back to the central tension. Without clear words from the Pope himself, the world is left to speculate. And in the void, shadows grow. The silence remains. And with each passing year, the question grows louder. Is Pope Francis guiding the Church into a new era, or watching it unravel? In the next section, we'll shift from the Vatican to the bishops around the world, many of whom are now openly opposing Rome. Is the global Church beginning to fracture? And if so, was that part of the warning all along? It began with murmurs. Quiet dissent spoken behind cathedral doors. A pastoral letter here, a footnote in a homily there. But over time, those whispers grew louder. And now, for the first time in living memory, bishops across the world are openly contradicting Rome. The question is not whether there is disunity, it's how deep that divide goes, and whether it reflects the very warning long suspected to lie within the Third Secret of Fatima. The Catholic Church is built on a concept of unity, a single body, one doctrine, one voice. But in recent years, the voice has splintered. Bishops in Germany, for example, have pushed forward with what they call a synodal path, aiming to modernize church teachings on sexuality, celibacy, and gender. These proposals, blessings for same-sex unions, laypeople influencing doctrine, even suggestions for female ordination, go far beyond debate. They mark in the eyes of many a rupture. The Vatican has attempted to rein them in. Letters have been issued, statements of caution sent. But the German bishops have pressed on, insisting that the Spirit is leading them forward even if Rome is not. Elsewhere, the story is inverted. In Africa, Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe, bishops are holding tightly to tradition, resisting reforms proposed by Pope Francis and his allies. In America, divisions are now so pronounced that entire dioceses differ in how they interpret papal teachings. In one parish, divorced and remarried Catholics may receive communion. In another, they are denied. One bishop may embrace synodality, another may condemn it. It's not just disagreement, it's schism in everything but name. This fragmentation echoes the very fear at the heart of the Third Secret: that the Church would be attacked not from outside, but from within. That a great apostasy would begin at the top and spread downward like a slow spiritual erosion. Now scholars debate whether this kind of global disunity was inevitable. After all, Catholicism is a worldwide religion stretching across cultures, languages, and political systems. Some argue that a little healthy debate is simply part of a dynamic church. But others see something darker. They point out that what used to be theological nuance has morphed into contradiction, that the teachings of one bishop can now directly oppose the teachings of another. How can a single faith survive when its shepherds disagree? In 2020, a prominent American archbishop publicly stated that certain papal statements were confusing and in tension with past doctrine. He was not reprimanded. Instead, his words were echoed by others. Slowly, the tone has shifted from cautious questioning to open resistance. To those who believe in the prophetic power of Fatima, this is precisely what was warned. Cardinal Mario Luigi Chiappi, a papal theologian, reportedly once said the Third Secret foretold apostasy in the Church, beginning at the top. If true, that means not only confusion from the Vatican, but division radiating outward, disrupting the unity of bishops and the clarity of teaching. One particularly haunting quote attributed to Sister Lucia in private conversation described a time when cardinals would oppose cardinals and bishops would oppose bishops. It seemed vague at the time. Now it sounds eerily specific. Of course, the Church has weathered storms before: the Reformation, the Avignon Papacy, the Council of Trent. Schism is not new. But what makes this moment different is its subtlety. There is no formal declaration of heresy, no council calling for rebellion. Instead, it is the quiet erosion of consensus, each bishop deciding more and more what Catholicism means in his corner of the world. And this decentralization, though promoted as a way to listen to the faithful, may also be opening the door to chaos. Some theologians argue that we're witnessing the unraveling of the Church's teaching authority, that when bishops no longer speak with a unified voice, the entire structure begins to sway. It's no longer clear what is dogma and what is opinion. Faithful Catholics find themselves bewildered, unsure whether the Mass they attend aligns with the Vatican or contradicts it. Within the Vatican itself, this crisis has not gone unnoticed. Several synods under Pope Francis have attempted to address the growing divide. But these meetings intended to foster communion often reveal the depths of disagreement. When German bishops propose one vision of the Church and African bishops offer another, the resulting documents become exercises in ambiguity. Language is softened, definitions blurred. Some call it mercy, others confusion. And confusion, as history shows, is fertile ground for mistrust. There are even claims often dismissed as fringe that some bishops now question whether the current papacy is fully legitimate. The sedevacantist movement, though small, has gained quiet traction in recent years, arguing that the throne of Peter is effectively empty, not because there is no pope, but because the man who occupies it has, they say, deviated from authentic doctrine. It's a radical claim, and yet its growing presence reflects just how deep the fracture runs, and this is where the prophecy circles return. If Fatima's third secret warned of a spiritual crisis, a war not against the Church, but within it, then this era of episcopal division may be its most visible symptom. A slow-motion collapse disguised as dialogue, a storm hidden behind words like listening and inclusion. No fire from the sky, no angel with a flaming sword. Just contradiction, confusion, division. The question now is whether this fracture can be healed, or whether it marks the beginning of something irreversible. A church no longer one, but many, each speaking with its own voice, each following its own truth. In the next section, we step away from the human voices and look upward. Because as the bishops divided the heavens, some say began to speak. Celestial signs, Marian apparitions ignored warnings. Were they mere coincidences, or were they the final messages? Before it's too late. There are moments in history when the sky doesn't behave, when stars dance, suns spin, moons turn red or vanish altogether. Sometimes these moments pass quietly, dismissed as optical illusions, natural phenomena, tricks of the light. Other times they leave behind crowds, stunned entire nations, stirred in quiet whispers that perhaps, just perhaps, someone is trying to say something. October 13th, 1917, Fatima, Portugal. Tens of thousands of people stood in a muddy field beneath a heavy sky. They had come because 3 children said the Virgin Mary would perform a miracle. At first it rained. Soaked to the bone, the crowds waited, and then the sun emerged. But it didn't shine. It moved. Witnesses described the sun spinning like a wheel, radiating vibrant colors, then plunging toward the earth in a zigzag pattern before returning to its place in the sky. These testimonies came from believers, skeptics, atheists, even reporters who'd come to mock the event and instead found themselves blinking in disbelief. The Church would later call it the miracle of the sun. One of the few times in history a supposed supernatural event had so many public witnesses. For those present, it was confirmation that the apparitions were real, that something holy or at least unexplainable had taken place. But here's the uncomfortable part: it wasn't the only time the sky would behave strangely, and not all those signs would be heeded. Just before World War II, Sister Lucia, the last surviving Fatima seer, wrote that a mysterious, unknown light would signal the beginning of another great conflict. On January 25, 1938, the skies across Europe glowed blood red. From Scotland to Switzerland, people reported an eerie crimson hue stretching across the horizon. Fire brigades were summoned. Radio stations buzzed. Some thought entire cities were burning, but no fire was found. Aurora borealis, the scientists said. A solar storm. Just light and magnetism. But Lucia insisted that was the sign, the warning, and by September 1939 the world was at war. Throughout the 20th century, other events would spark similar debate. Unexplained Marian apparitions reported in places like Garabandal, Spain, Kibeho, Rwanda, and most famously, Akita, Japan. In each case, visionaries claimed messages from the Virgin. Warnings of fire from the sky, internal corruption, a church torn in two. In Akita, the 1973 messages were especially specific. Sister Agnes Sasagawa, a nun in a remote convent, reported receiving both visions and audible messages from a wooden statue of Mary. Among the most chilling lines was this: "The work of the devil will infiltrate even into the church. Cardinals will oppose cardinals. Bishops will oppose bishops." Sound familiar? The church, after investigation, approved the Akita events as worthy of belief, which is rare, very rare. And yet to this day, most Catholics have never heard of it, because these messages, like so many others, have been quietly sidelined. And while the faithful continue to report visions, weeping statues, sun phenomena, the institutional church has become more cautious, more clinical. Miracles take decades to approve, if ever. Apparitions are tested with psychological evaluations, environmental reports, chemical analyses, and most never pass the bar. But believers aren't deterred. In fact, modern media has created a new kind of pulpit. Online, entire communities track signs in the heavens: blood moons, eclipses, solar flares. They post side-by-side comparisons, prophecies, and headlines, astrological charts, and papal statements. They say the skies are screaming, and no one's listening. Critics, of course, call this superstition, a reversion to medieval thinking. The sun spins, the moon cries blood, it's all weather and physics. They argue that the more we understand the cosmos, the less we need to cloak it in mystery. But that doesn't explain the patterns, because these signs often appear in clusters coinciding with political upheaval, papal transitions, global conflict. The coincidences are hard to ignore. And here we return to the Vatican's silence. Even when signs are witnessed by thousands, the Church rarely comments. No official statements, no investigations, no clarification, just distance, as if acknowledging the signs might give them power, or worse, validation. Some insiders claim that the Vatican is wary of fueling hysteria, that past missteps like overemphasizing Fatima or embracing fringe mystics have made them gun-shy. Others believe the silence is strategic, that if the Third Secret does mention signs in the sky, if it really does warn of omens ignored, then the hierarchy has every reason to pretend the heavens are quiet. Because to admit otherwise would be to admit failure, that the warnings came, and they were missed. There's also the question of what responsibility the Church holds. If celestial signs are real, and if they herald danger or divine warning, then the Church becomes accountable. They would have to interpret, explain, prepare, and perhaps confess. So the silence continues. But believers persist. They travel to apparition sites. They pray rosaries during eclipses. They scan the skies during Marian feast days. And when the clouds swirl or the sun glows a little too brightly, they remember that one day in 1917, when children pointed upward and the heavens moved. It's important to note that not every Catholic sees prophecy in the skies. Many shrug it off, choosing faith through community service and the quiet routines of parish life. But for others, especially those steeped in the lore of Fatima, every ignored sign feels like one more page in a prophecy unfolding in real time. And maybe that's the point. Maybe these signs were never meant to terrify, but to remind that heaven is still watching, that history is not random, that the Church, for all its structures and councils and theologians, might still be subject to forces far beyond its marble walls. In the next section, we'll examine two of the most startling Marian messages ever given: Fatima and Akita side by side. Different continents, different decades, but are they speaking of the same future? And if so, why did the Church treat one as miracle and bury the other in whispers? There's something uncanny about distant voices saying the same thing, something unsettling when two whispers uttered decades apart, half a world away from each other, seem to finish one another's sentence. Fatima and Akita, Portugal and Japan. 1917 and 1973. On the surface, they look like separate stories, but pull them side by side, and the resemblance turns haunting. Let's begin with the foundations. Fatima, as we've explored, was a sequence of apparitions received by 3 shepherd children in 1917. The Virgin Mary, they claimed, appeared monthly offering messages of warning, penance, and prayer. Among those messages were 3 secrets, the last of which never publicly revealed until 2000 became the subject of intense speculation. Visions of hell, the rise of atheistic regimes, and in the most mysterious third message, a prophecy sealed in Vatican silence for over 4 decades. Akita, on the other hand, unfolded in rural Japan in the early 1970s. Sister Agnes Sasagawa, a novice nun in a convent outside Akita City, reported supernatural phenomena, most notably a wooden statue of the Virgin Mary that wept tears, emitted light, and allegedly delivered messages. These weren't vague, poetic pronouncements. They were precise, direct, and most disturbingly catastrophic. At the heart of both apparitions is a shared theme: the coming crisis of the Church, and not one born of external threat, but internal rot. In Fatima, it was said that the final secret warned of apostasy beginning at the top of the hierarchy. In Akita, Mary's message explicitly stated that the work of the devil will infiltrate even into the Church in such a way that one will see cardinals opposing cardinals, bishops against bishops. That phrasing alone, verbatim echoed by more than one Fatima researcher, caused a stir. 2 completely unrelated visionaries, both isolated from one another, describing the same future, or perhaps the same present, and the overlap doesn't stop there. Both Fatima and Akita warn of severe chastisements if the world refuses to repent. Fatima's vision showed a flaming sword suspended over the world, held back only by Mary's intercession. In Akita, the Virgin declared that fire will fall from the sky, killing a great portion of humanity, leaving survivors envious of the dead. That's not metaphor, that's apocalypse. Now, some theologians dismiss Akita as a coincidence. They point to regional mysticism, Japanese cultural symbolism, and the long history of Marian devotion as fertile ground for dramatized vision. But the Church didn't dismiss Akita, not officially. In fact, Bishop John Shojiro Ito, the local ordinary of the diocese, investigated the events thoroughly and declared them of supernatural origin in 1984. The Vatican was informed, and Rome remained quiet, which is curious, because when Fatima occurred, the Church took decades to confirm its validity, while at the same time aggressively promoting the associated messages of repentance and the Rosary. With Akita, the theological approval came far faster, yet the message remained obscure, almost buried. Why? Perhaps because Akita went further. It didn't just suggest internal corruption, it described it. It didn't merely warn of a future cataclysm, it assigned blame. According to the message, the Blessed Virgin is the only one who can still help. The implication: the Church could no longer be fully trusted to steer its own course. And here's where the parallels deepen. Both Sister Lucia and Sister Agnes lived most of their lives under obedience and silence. Both became symbols, icons, used by either side of the debate to validate or refute prophecy. And both, crucially, were kept at arm's length by the Vatican, their full testimonies never published in full. It raises the question, are Fatima and Akita 2 parts of the same prophecy? Could Akita be the missing piece? The final layer of the third secret. There are whispers, though unconfirmed, that Cardinal Ratzinger, before he became Pope Benedict XVI, made quiet reference to Akita during private conversations about Fatima. He reportedly said that the messages were essentially the same. If true, it's an astonishing admission. because it would mean the Vatican has known for decades that the true content of the Third Secret was not a vision of a dying pope and a crumbling city, but a spiritual war from within. A war where truth and falsehood share the same altar, where shepherds lead flocks in opposite directions, and where the faithful are left unsure whom to follow. And if both Fatima and Akita foretell the same unraveling, why hasn't the Church connected the dots? Some suggest it's a matter of damage control. That to officially link the two would validate a level of internal critique the hierarchy isn't willing to face. After all, if the Virgin is warning against bishops and cardinals, it becomes difficult to turn those bishops and cardinals into gatekeepers of the message. Others believe it's a deeper issue, that acknowledging the unity of the messages would suggest the Church has failed in its prophetic responsibility, that heaven cried out not once but twice and was met with denial. And so the silence holds. But in the world outside the Vatican walls, believers have done the math. Fatima plus Akita equals a singular warning the Church will suffer a crisis not of persecution, but of betrayal from within. Which brings us to a chilling implication. If Akita is, in effect, the continuation of Fatima, an addendum heaven had to provide, because the first message was censored or misunderstood, then what we're living through now is not mystery. It's fulfillment. The division among bishops, the confusion in doctrine, the exodus of the faithful. These aren't symptoms. They're signals, echoes of a warning spoken over a century ago, one that may have begun in Portugal, but found its voice in Japan. In the next chapter, we return to the vision at the heart of the controversy, a detail reportedly erased from public release, but whispered by insiders for decades, a pope fleeing a ruined Rome. If such a vision existed, what did it mean, and why would the Vatican want to hide it? It begins with a mountain, a steep path, a city in ruins, and a figure in white climbing slowly, deliberately toward the summit. Along the way, he passes corpses. He weeps, he prays, and at the top, just before a cross, he is struck down by soldiers. Arrows and bullets pierce him, and he dies. This was the vision revealed by the Vatican in 2000, said to be the long-hidden Third Secret of Fatima. It was dramatic, symbolic, tragic. But for many who had followed the Fatima saga for decades, something didn't feel right. Not because of what was in the vision, but because of what was missing. For years, rumors had circulated that the true Third Secret described something very different, that it included a scene of the Pope fleeing Rome. Not merely ascending a symbolic hill, but escaping a collapsing city. Smoke, chaos, apostasy. A church in utter disarray. These rumors were not born in the minds of fringe theorists. They came from sources inside the church, clergy scholars and even cardinals who had reportedly seen or at least heard about the original message written by Sister Lucia. The details varied slightly, but a core image always returned the Pope leaving Rome in haste, stepping over bodies of priests and laypeople alike, passing shattered altars and burning churches. One of the earliest public mentions of this vision came not from Lucia, but from a German magazine called Stimme des Glaubens in the 1980s. It cited anonymous Vatican sources who claimed the real Third Secret involved a global apostasy and a flight of the Holy Father. Then came Malachi Martin, the Vatican insider, who, as we explored earlier, hinted cryptically on radio broadcasts that the vision included a pope with tears in his eyes escaping a devastated Rome. Official church spokesmen dismissed these accounts as exaggerations or misunderstandings. They insisted that the vision published in 2000 was complete, that its meaning, while symbolic, had been fulfilled by the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. But that explanation left a bitter aftertaste. A bullet wound doesn't destroy a church, and the vision of Fatima doesn't describe survival. It describes death. So why interpret it as an allegory for survival? Why such a sanitized reading, and what of the elements conspicuously absent from the released vision? In the 1950s, Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, who reportedly read The Secret, said it contained references to a great crisis of faith within the Church. Cardinal Chiappi allegedly claimed The Secret spoke of apostasy beginning at the top. These statements are not reflected anywhere in the 2000 vision, which leads us to one possibility that there were two texts, a vision and an interpretation, or a symbolic image and a separate written explanation from the Virgin herself. This theory gained traction after it was discovered that two different envelopes were involved, one kept in the congregation for the doctrine of the faith and another reportedly in the papal apartment. And the handwriting didn't always match. But perhaps the most compelling clue comes from Pope Benedict XVI himself. In 2010, a full decade after the vision's release, he made a surprising statement. He said, "We would be mistaken to think that Fatima's prophetic mission is complete." He referenced future sufferings of the church attacks from within and global upheaval. Which begs the question, if the secret had already been revealed and fulfilled, what was he talking about? Could it be that the vision released was real but partial? That the most explosive part, the Pope fleeing Rome, was deliberately withheld? If so, the implications are profound. Because such a vision would not be merely symbolic. It would be chillingly literal. The idea of a pope driven from the seat of Peter suggests collapse not just of faith, but of structure. A Rome no longer safe, a Vatican abandoned, and at the center a pontiff on the run, not just from enemies, but from his own shepherds. Some suggest that this vision might be more about a spiritual flight, that the fleeing pope represents one who abandons traditional doctrine or flees the truth of the gospel. But the consistency of physical imagery, smoke, fire, rubble hints at something more tangible. A warning not just of metaphorical decay, but of visible historical catastrophe. And here's where it becomes personal. Because when Pope Benedict resigned in 2013, the first pontiff to do so in nearly 600 years, some saw it as the first step in that vision. A spiritual departure from Rome. Then came images of him leaving the apostolic palace, the helicopter lifting off from Vatican City, a literal flight, a pope leaving. He was succeeded by Pope Francis, and suddenly two popes lived within the Vatican walls, one dressed in white, one retired, but still referred to as Holy Father by some. For those immersed in Fatima's secrets, it was difficult not to see echoes. Because what if the vision was never meant to describe just one event? What if it was a chain of crisis, collapse, flight, and death, a sequence already in motion playing out in real time? And why would the Vatican withhold that? Perhaps they feared panic. Or maybe they believed that prophecy once known becomes inevitable. That if the faithful saw the church as doomed, they would abandon her. Better perhaps to let the vision remain sealed, to interpret symbolically, to manage hope. But secrecy breeds mistrust, and silence over time speaks loudly. Now more than ever, Catholics and scholars alike are questioning what else lies unrevealed. If the vision of the fleeing pope was part of the original Third Secret, then its omission is not just a theological decision, it's a deliberate act of suppression. In the next section, we approach one of the darkest and most misunderstood elements of Vatican prophecy, the so-called Black Pope. Is this merely a poetic phrase, or has a centuries-old vision warned us that the final pope may not be what he seems? There's a phrase that drifts through the margins of Catholic prophecy like a shadow. It is whispered more often than explained. feared more than understood. The Black Pope. Some hear it and imagine a literal figure cloaked in darkness standing at the altar as flames consume the church. Others believe it refers to the superior general of the Jesuits nicknamed the Black Pope because of his traditional black cassock and global influence. But in prophecy, the term carries a weight far heavier than fashion or office. It is, they say, a title for the last pope, the one who leads the church into ruin. This concept emerges most famously from the so-called prophecy of the popes, attributed to Saint Malachy, a 12th century Irish bishop who supposedly received a list of all future popes in a vision. The document lists 112 popes, each identified by cryptic Latin mottos. The final one, Peter the Roman, is described not with a motto, but a warning that during his reign, the city of 7 hills will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people. The prophecy ends there. No more popes. For centuries, the Church has dismissed the Malachy prophecy as a forgery, a Renaissance-era hoax designed to curry favor with certain papal candidates. And yet, the last few mottos, particularly those from the 20th century onward, have aligned with eerie precision. One motto referred to labor of the sun, aligning with a pope born during a solar eclipse and buried under one. Another mentioned glory of the olive, a rare symbol associated with peace and Benedictine prophecy, later assigned to Pope Benedict XVI. And then, we come to the final entry. Pope Francis. He is not called Peter the Roman by name, but he is the 112th pope on the list. He was born Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the son of Italian immigrants Romans by heritage. He took the name Francis in honor of Saint Francis of Assisi, who was born Giovanni di Pietro. John of Peter. It's thin ice, perhaps, but the numbers, the lineage, the name, they all suggest that we are at least symbolically in the final chapter of the prophecy. But what of the Black Pope? Here's where history and symbolism twist together. As mentioned, the head of the Jesuits has long been dubbed the Black Pope, not because of sinister intent, but because of his influence and attire. For centuries, Jesuits wielded enormous power in missionary work, education, and theological development. So much so that they were suppressed entirely by Pope Clement XIV in 1773, only to be restored in 1814. Pope Francis is the first Jesuit pope in history. Let that sink in. For over 400 years, the Jesuits served, taught, influenced, but never ruled. Then, in a moment unprecedented in church history, a Jesuit not only ascended to the papacy, but did so while his predecessor still lived, a pope in white with a Jesuit soul. And behind him, the Jesuit order remained powerful, global, and some argue divisive. Now, is that inherently ominous? Not necessarily. But prophecy doesn't speak in politics. It speaks in signs, symbols, and strange convergences. And the convergence of Pope Francis, the Jesuit order, the number 112, and the silence on Fatima is hard to ignore. To add more shadow to the fire, we turn to an obscure 18th century prophecy by a Capuchin friar named Blessed Tomasuccio de Foligno. He wrote of a time when the Pope will flee Rome in a bloody night, and a man clothed in black will take his place, claiming authority, but not holding the truth. That man, he said, will cause schism, division, collapse. Sound familiar? Others point to the writings of Venerable Bartholomew Holzhauser, a 17th century mystic, who described a future era of decadence and heresy in the Church. He saw a time of dual authorities, two leaders claiming legitimacy, a true pope hidden, and a false one reigning in plain sight. Now, skeptics rightly ask if every generation believes it is the last. Isn't prophecy always self-fulfilling, perhaps? But most generations don't live to see two popes in white or a church split on nearly every issue of doctrine and discipline. Most generations don't witness open rebellion from bishops' mass apostasy in the pews, and a world increasingly hostile to the very idea of religion. The concept of a black pope isn't necessarily about skin or cassock. It may not even be about the Jesuits directly. It may be about inversion, a church turned inside out, a leader who wears the garments of Peter but speaks the words of another. A pope who unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, fulfills a role not of protection, but of transition. Into what? That's the question. And so we ask, is Pope Francis the Black Pope of prophecy? Or is he merely the Pope during the time the Black Pope arises? Either way, the prophecy warns of a reckoning. A church brought to its knees not by armies or famines, but by confusion, by division, by shepherds who lead in opposite directions. And that brings us full circle. Because whether through Fatima, Akita, or Maliki, the message is the same: the Church will face a trial not seen since its earliest days, a darkness not external but internal. And from that trial it may emerge purified, or it may not emerge at all. In our final 2 chapters, we turn now to the evidence as a whole. The testimonies, the contradictions, the timelines. What do they tell us? And more importantly, what has been hidden from us? Let's bring it all together. You've walked the corridors of power, traced the folds of parchment sealed under wax, and listened for the quietest breaths of long-dead visionaries. Now, with the mystery laid bare across centuries of secrecy, speculation, and suppressed truths, one question remains. What does it all mean? Let's look back not as a list, but as a weave, a tapestry of details, threads crossing at strange, deliberate angles. It began in a field. 3 children, a radiant woman above an oak tree. Her words were simple yet filled with consequence, a warning of war, a request for repentance, and something else, something so devastating that the final part of the message was wrapped, sealed, and tucked away for over 40 years. That delay alone was telling. Why 1960? Why a command from the Virgin herself to reveal it then, and such a firm refusal to comply? That year came and went. The Church said nothing, and the silence was louder than any sermon. Then came the 2000 release of Vision, yes, but stripped of explanation. A pope gunned down at the foot of a cross, surrounded by ruins. Theologians were told it symbolized past events already fulfilled. But witnesses, former insiders, even popes themselves said otherwise. Cardinal Bertone, in his careful language, insisted it was the whole secret, yet his strained interviews suggested discomfort. Cardinal Ratzinger, who would become Pope Benedict XVI, offered a cautious reading, but later, as we now know, expressed doubts that the prophecy had run its course. Malachi Martin's cryptic clues, Sister Lucia's sudden silence, the bizarre chain of envelopes, the mention of apostasy from the top, all of these fragments point in one direction, toward a warning not of physical destruction, but of spiritual implosion. Again and again we return to one central theme: betrayal from within. Not an asteroid, not armies storming St. Peter's, but something more insidious, something harder to see: the erosion of doctrine, the weakening of resolve, bishops contradicting each other, popes coexisting in strained harmony, clergy hesitating to preach what they once proclaimed without apology. The Church no longer crucified by the world, but dissolving into it. Even those who dismiss prophecy must acknowledge the uncanny parallels between the visions and the world we now inhabit. The Virgin of Akita warned of cardinals opposing cardinals, of a church filled with compromise and confusion. That message, given in 1973, was approved by the local bishop and confirmed to be of supernatural origin by the Vatican. Yet few remember it. Fewer still speak of it. because speaking the full truth of these messages might force an uncomfortable reckoning. So what are we left with? A vision of a pope fleeing Rome, a warning about apostasy beginning at the top, a refusal to publish the secret when told to, a replacement secret that reads more like a symbol than a confession, and a silence from the current pontiff that feels loaded, intentional. Then there's the slow drift, the moral confusion, the split among bishops, the growing coldness in the pews, the laughter during heresy and the silence during truth, and hovering above it all the sense that something has shifted irreversibly. Some say that's just modernity, a natural evolution of faith. Others whisper that this is exactly what the message predicted. A church that survives not by strength, but by forgetting who she is. That hides prophecy because acknowledging it would mean admitting that the storm is not ahead, it's already here. But if this truly is the secret the Virgin gave, and if the Church has known for decades, then the implications are more than theological. They are moral, ethical. Why keep it hidden? Why not prepare the faithful? Perhaps the hierarchy feared despair. Perhaps they hoped it could be averted by silence. Or perhaps, and this is harder to admit, they simply didn't believe. Or they did, and that's why they hid it. Because some truths change everything. Some truths undo systems. And if the prophecy is not merely a vision but a verdict, then no amount of suppression can stop what's coming. There's one more question to ask. Not of the Vatican, not of popes or visionaries, but of yourself. If the end of the Church has been foretold, not metaphorically, but explicitly, what do you do with that? Do you prepare? Do you hope or do you walk away? In our final section, we'll drift slowly into the final image. A world where the greatest secret of the Church was never about protecting the faithful from fear, but protecting the hierarchy from accountability. We'll let the dust settle and the silence speak. So, here we are. The final page of a manuscript never meant to be read. The end of a long, candlelit corridor of whispers, folded letters, unspoken names. You followed the trail, soft-footed and open-eyed, through decades of ambiguity and centuries of faith. And whether you believe in prophecy or not, whether you trust the words of mystics or the silence of popes, one truth is harder to escape than any other. The Church knew, or at least, someone did. And maybe that's the real message buried in all this. Not just that a prophecy warned of collapse, or that celestial voices spoke in secrets, but that those in power, those who claim to guide the souls of billions, may have chosen silence over truth. The silence is the most chilling part, isn't it? Not the vision of bloodied robes at the base of a ruined city. Not the whispers of schism or apostasy or even fire from the sky. But the decision not to speak. Not to trust the people of God with what was given to them. Not to prepare them for what might come, or what is already here. If the end of the Church as we've known it is real, it won't arrive with trumpets or apocalypse. It will come softly, like a hymn fading out of tune, like incense that no longer rises, like cathedrals that echo with memory, not prayer. But maybe that's not the end. Maybe like so many mysteries, the real power of this story isn't in what was hidden, but in what it awakens. Not in fear, but in clarity, in conviction, in the quiet choice to see what others refuse to see and still walk forward. Even when the sanctuary cracks, even when the altar shakes, even when the shepherds grow silent, especially then. And now the candle burns low. Let yourself drift. The hall is quiet. The archives are closed. The prophecy sleeps again beneath stone and key. But you heard it. and that perhaps is enough.